1, 2, test 1, 2, 3.
Please enter the meeting passcode, followed by the pound sign. Please enter the meeting passcode followed by the pound sign.
Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead and just turn it up more. Test 1, 2, 3, 4.
Now try.
Yep, I think it's coming through. Nope. Okay. The webcast will begin at 9:30. The webcast will begin at 9:30.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Wednesday, June 7th. It is 9:30 a.m., and I'd like to call this meeting back into order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board colleagues. With me here today is Board Member Sean McGuire and Board Member Nicole Morgan, and joining us virtually is Vice Chair Doreen Diadamo and Board Member Laurel Firestone. We're also joined by our Executive Director, Eileen Sobek, our Chief Deputy, Eric Oppenheimer, our Chief Counsel, Michael Loffer. Our Clerk of the Board is Courtney Tyler, and assisting her today is Meredith Thompson and Margie Argel. As you can see, this meeting is a hybrid meeting, and it's being webcast and recorded. So for those of you joining us virtually, you're either watching on the Cal EPA stream or the YouTube live stream, but if you intend to comment on today's item, you should be on the Zoom platform with us. You can do so by following instructions at the top of today's agenda. There's a link there. You'll receive a link to the meeting room and a password. If you are having any challenges, though, getting into the room or need to find other accommodation, please do just reach out to the clerk of the board at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov, and she can help get you onto the platform. Once you're on the platform, your camera will be off. You'll be on mute until it is your opportunity to speak on the item you've indicated you wish to speak on. For everyone in the room, good morning. Good to see you this morning. We're here in the Cal EPA building in Sacramento. A few quick announcements here as well. Please do observe the exits. If for some reason there is an emergency, we'll just calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza and await further instruction. If you intend on commenting on today's item, there's a QR code at the back of the room to be able to sign up to speak. You can also just go to the clerk if you're having any issues. And please do state your name, any affiliation if you have one, once you're up at the podium. One last thing, please do silence any phones or noise-making devices just so that we can, it's a particularly small room, have an uninterrupted discussion here with each other. With that, we don't have public forum. That was yesterday's meeting, so we are getting straight into our informational item today, and would like to hand it over to Alyssa and to discuss today's item. Thank you.
Chair Esquivel and board members. My name is Alyssa Osaluzo. I'm a senior environmental scientist in the Division of Water. With me today is Diane Riddle, one of the assistant deputy directors in the division, Rob McCarthy, a senior environmental scientist and the board's Bay Delta tribal coordinator, and Tina Cannon-Leahy with the Office of Chief Counsel. Rob and I will be presenting information regarding the possible addition of tribal beneficial uses to the water quality control plan for the San Francisco Bay, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta Estuary, or simply Bay Delta Plan. Tina and Diane will also be available for questions. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the tribal representatives who have joined us today to address the board after staff's presentation. Next slide, please. So I'll start by providing a summary of the topics we plan to discuss today. First, I'll begin with a brief overview of the Bay Delta Plan. I'll also go over the current status of the update and implementation efforts for the Bay Delta Plan. Next, staff will provide a summary of the tribal outreach and engagement efforts that have occurred so far. Then we'll go over the tribal beneficial uses that are proposed to be added to the Bay Delta Plan, as well as a summary of next steps and future opportunities for public engagement on this topic. Following the staff presentation, we'll turn it over to tribal representatives to provide their comments. Next slide, please. To provide context for today, I'll provide a little background on the Bay Delta Plan and the update and implementation efforts. The State Water Board protects water quality that affects beneficial uses of water in the Bay Delta in part through its Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, or Bay Delta Plan. The Bay Delta Plan identifies beneficial uses of water in the Bay Delta, including municipal, industrial, agricultural, and fish and wildlife uses. Water quality objectives to reasonably protect those beneficial uses, and a program of implementation to achieve the objectives. The water quality objectives in the Bay Delta Plan are primarily flow dependent and include both narrative and numeric objectives. The program of implementation includes both flow and non-flow actions, as well as actions by the board and other entities. The State Water Board is required by state and federal law to periodically review its water quality control plans, including the Bay Delta Plan, and to update those plans as needed through a public process. Next slide, please. This slide shows an overall map of the Bay Delta watershed and the areas covered by the Bay Delta planning and implementation processes. The board's Bay Delta planning and implementation efforts are a very high priority of the board due to the critical role the watershed plays in the state. The Bay Delta watershed includes the Sacramento and San Joaquin River systems, the Delta, Sassoon Marsh, and San Francisco Bay, and is a crucial source of water for the people of California and the environment. As one of the largest tidal estuaries on the western coast of the Americas, it supports a vast array of aquatic, terrestrial, and avian wildlife. The watershed and the salmon and other species it supports are of significant importance to tribal communities for nutritional, cultural, religious, and other purposes. In addition, the watershed is an integral part of the state's water supply system and helps provide water to 2/3 of California's population and millions of acres of farmland. Next slide, please. For decades, native species in the Bay Delta watershed have been experiencing an ecological crisis. Populations are in substantial and prolonged decline due to ecosystem stressors, including flow alteration, habitat loss, and degraded water quality. Critical habitat has been converted to farmland and urban uses. The timing and distribution of flows have been altered, and species have been cut off from natal waters. In addition, other aquatic ecosystem stressors, such as climate change, continue to impact native species. State Water Board is the primary agency responsible for addressing the flow and water quality issues in the watershed and is doing so through its efforts to update and implement the Bay Delta Plan. The planning and implementation efforts are focused on updating requirements such as flow and water quality objectives to provide protection for native species throughout the watershed. Next slide, please. The Sacramento River and San Joaquin River are two vast and distinct river systems. Therefore, the update and implementation of the Bay Delta Plan is being considered based on those two geographic regions and the specific issues concerning each of them. This slide shows the different processes currently ongoing to update and implement the Bay Delta Plan. The first two processes are part of the San Joaquin River system. In 2018, the board adopted updated flow objectives for the reasonable protection of fish and wildlife in the lower San Joaquin River and its east side tributaries, the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers. Currently, the board is working to implement the lower San Joaquin River objectives that were adopted in 2018. Separately, the board is considering a proposal for a voluntary agreement on the Tuolumne River. The voluntary agreement is being considered separately because it does not fully conform to the 2018 Bay Delta Plan update. The third process is specific to the Sacramento River system and includes consideration of Bay Delta Plan amendments to address Sacramento River and east side tributary inflows and cold water habitat, delta outflows, and interior delta flow. This is referred simply to as the Sacramento Delta update. The Sacramento Delta update also includes consideration of proposed voluntary agreements for providing flows and restoring habitat supported by proposed governance and science programs. In the following slides, I'll cover the status of each of these processes in a little more detail. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, the board is working on implementing the lower San Joaquin River flows and southern delta salinity objectives. The board is currently developing a draft regulation and draft environmental impact report in support of the regulation that would assign responsibility to water right holders to meet the lower San Joaquin River flow and southern delta salinity objectives. The draft regulation and draft EIR will be part of a public process and are expected to be released in early 2024. Next slide, please. The Tuolumne River Voluntary Agreement, or VA, is a proposal that could serve as an alternative method to update and implement the Bay Delta Plan. In April 2023, the board began the public process for the proposed Tuolumne River VA by issuing a notice of preparation of environmental documentation to consider possible amendments to the Bay Delta Plan to incorporate the Tuolumne River VA. In May, staff held a scoping meeting to receive input on the proposed VA from public agencies, California Native American tribes, and members of the public. A draft report identifying the scientific basis for the Tuolumne River VA is planned to be released for public review and comment in fall of 2023. A draft staff report evaluating the possible environmental and related effects of the Tuolumne River VA is planned for release as early 2024, with possible consideration of changes to the Bay Delta Plan in mid to late 2024. The board will conduct a full public review process before considering whether to approve the Tuolumne River VA and incorporate it into the Bay Delta Plan. Next slide, please. The Sacramento Delta update is currently in the planning stage. The board is preparing a draft staff report and environmental documentation in support of the proposed Sacramento Delta amendments that is planned for release in late summer. This process also includes consideration of voluntary agreements. In January 2023, board staff, in coordination with the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, developed a draft scientific basis report supplement in support of the proposed voluntary agreements for public review and comment. Board staff are considering the comments received before updating the scientific basis report supplement and submitting it for independent external scientific peer review later this year. The draft staff report evaluating the potential environmental, economic, and other effects of the proposed updates, including the proposed voluntary agreements, will be released for public review and comment this summer. The board will also hold hearings to receive oral input. The board is planning to consider the Sacramento Delta updates to the Bay Delta Plan in mid to late 2024, which will also include a public review and comment process. As we go to the next slide, I'll turn it over to Rob McCarthy, who will cover the tribal beneficial uses that are being considered to be added to the Bay Delta Plan.
Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, Chair Esquivel, board members. My name is Rob McCarthy. I'm a senior environmental scientist, water rights. I want to start off by providing some information on staff's tribal outreach and engagement efforts related to the update and implementation of the Bay Delta Plan, as well as the feedback received through that outreach. Letters offering formal consultation to California Native American tribes on Bay Delta Plan update and implementation efforts were distributed on January 13th, 2023. Consultation letters regarding the Tuolumne River Voluntary Agreement were sent to tribes on April 11th, 2023. Due to poor contact information, those letters may not have reached their intended audience. Staff is aware of the deficiencies related to the State Water Board's tribal contact information and are endeavoring to improve it. I'd like to take a moment now to reiterate State Water Boards offer a formal consultation on Bay Delta planning efforts. If there are any tribal representatives interested in initiating formal consultation, please contact me or send an email to bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. We'll also have contact information available on the final slide of this presentation. In addition to letters offering formal consultation, board staff held 2 listening sessions for tribal representatives to provide background on the Bay Delta planning processes, highlight tribal engagement opportunities, and to request assistance with incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, into the Bay Delta planning and implementation efforts. Through that outreach, tribal representatives requested the specific recognition of tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses to the Bay Delta plan. Today's informational item is being held in response to that feedback. As we progress through the Bay Delta Plan update and implementation process, staff are committed to ongoing engagement with California Native American tribes, and we look forward to continuing developing those relationships. Next slide, please. 2017, the State Water Board established and defined tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses. These beneficial uses were developed in collaboration with California tribes and the public. The definitions for the new beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan are the same as those previously established by the board when it adopted Part 2 of the Water Quality Control Plan for inland surface waters, enclosed bays, and estuaries of California, which addressed tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses and mercury provisions. Although we are incorporating the definitions in the Bay Delta Plan, we are not incorporating the introductory language from the Water Quality Control Plan for inland surface waters, enclosed bays, and estuaries of California related to the exclusion of flows, because the Bay Delta Plan is significantly differ different in that it is a flow-based plan. The two tribal beneficial uses are unique to California Native American tribes and include tribal tradition and culture, or CUL, and tribal subsistence fishing, or TSUB. Tribal tradition and culture, CUL, is defined as the uses of water that support the cultural, spiritual, ceremonial, or traditional rights or lifeways of California Native American tribes. Tribal subsistence fishing, or TSUB, is defined as the uses of water involving the non-commercial catching or gathering of natural aquatic resources for consumption by individuals, households, or communities of California Native American tribes to meet needs for sustenance. Slide, please. The board established and defined a third beneficial use for subsistence fishing by other individuals or cultures. Subsistence fishing, or SUB, is defined as the uses of water involving the non-commercial catching or gathering of natural aquatic resources, including fish and shellfish, for consumption by individuals, households, or communities to meet needs for sustenance. Next slide, please. The tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses I just described are largely consistent with the beneficial uses currently identified in the Bay Delta Plan. All beneficial uses identified within the Bay Delta Plan apply broadly throughout the watershed. Adding tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses would provide for explicit recognition of reasonable protection of these beneficial uses within the context and purview of the Bay Delta Plan. The reasonable protection of these beneficial uses through water quality objectives would primarily be achieved through flow-related requirements for fish and wildlife beneficial uses. In separate but complementary processes, the regional water quality control boards would continue actions related to addressing tribal beneficial uses within their purviews in their respective regional basin plans. State Water Board basin plans, when adopted, supersede regional basin plans for the same waters, but only to the extent of any conflict. Here, the Bay Delta Plan overlies areas within two regional water quality control boards, the San Francisco region, Region 2, and the Central Valley region, Region 5. In this way, it sits atop basin plans in those regions in a complementary way. It is expected that the regional boards would continue to take the lead on designating reaches to which TBUs apply and may even adopt region or site-specific water quality objectives as necessary. Stated another way, while the Bay Delta Plan addresses flows needed for native fish to reach sustainable populations, including for tribal subsistence fishing and subsistence fishing, the regional plans might address discharge requirements in certain water body segments, for example, the timing of the application of aquatic herbicides so that they do not interfere with cultural practices. The addition of tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses would also be consistent with the board's efforts to focus update and implementation efforts on ecosystem protection for the benefit of native species and tribal and other communities that rely on the Bay Delta watershed for subsistence fishing and cultural practices. Staff are proposing to add tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses to the Bay Delta Plan by identifying them in the upcoming draft staff report in support of the proposed Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta Plan. The consideration of adding tribal beneficial uses to the Bay Delta Plan will be part of a full public process, which I'll describe in a little more detail next. Next slide, please. Staff encourage tribal representatives and members of the public to continue to provide input on the Bay Delta Plan processes moving forward. After hearing feedback today, the next opportunity to provide input would be on the draft staff report for the Sacramento Delta update, which would evaluate inclusion of tribal and subsistence fishing beneficial uses. The draft staff report is planned for release later this summer for public review and comment. After the release of the draft staff report for the Sacramento Delta update, there will be additional opportunities to provide feedback through public meetings. This includes the eventual board meeting where the board will consider whether to adopt the Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta Plan. That board meeting is anticipated for mid to late 2024. Next slide, please. I'd also like to identify some resources available to interested parties who may wish to learn more about the Bay Delta Plan update and implementation processes and connect with staff if there are any questions. This slide provides a link to the main Bay Delta program page where you can find additional information on the full Bay Delta Plan update and implementation processes. Also listed here is a link to our Bay Delta Tribal Engagement page, which contains additional information and resources related to consultation with California Native American tribes on efforts to update and implement the Bay Delta Plan. We also encourage interested parties to subscribe to our Bay Delta Notices email subscription list to stay informed of Bay Delta watershed activities, including those related to the Bay Delta Plan. To subscribe, visit the main Bay Delta program page, scroll to the bottom where you'll find the box shown on this slide, and enter your name and email address. That concludes our staff presentation. Now I'd like to turn it over to our tribal panel, but we may have to exchange seats. So, thanks.
Thank you. And as you swap out here with folks, I just want to say and just express my thanks. This work is just so critical, as you stated to the board, and the incorporation of these tribal beneficial uses means a lot. And so I just want to thank you for that as we transition our folks here. Thanks. And at the top, I have to give you all thanks as well for self-organizing here and participating in this. I know we've had other conversations as well through our listening sessions, and appreciate the continuum now into this informational item. In response here, I feel deeply to what we've been hearing and the need to incorporate these. So just thank you for being here and participating. Who would like to kick off the panel?
Good morning.
Morning, Gary. Thank you.
Question, who are these guys?
These are our staff. This is our executive
staff.
director. Chief Deputy.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
And I want to say hi to Laurel, been a long time since CJCW. We were together on a committee or organization way back when we were younger. Anyway, I have some slides, but I know we're going to talk about tribal beneficial uses, but the slides I have cover kind of a lot of things that deal with water, water rights, tribal rights, those kind of things. So I hope you'll bear with me. I did have a video that I could have put out here. It was our chief speaking. It was an 8-minute video, but the link doesn't work now, so I'm sorry. And it was dealing specifically with one of our ceremonies that we have every time we have a young girl coming of age. Before, this used to happen every year, but we're down to 130 people in our tribe. So it doesn't happen every year that you have a girl coming of age, so you don't have that ceremony. We've had about 7 now since 2004. But if you could put those slides up, I guess, and I can start talking from there, I guess.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
you have to bear with me a little bit too, because I threw the slides thing together this morning. I was awake most of the night. I wasn't going to be here today. I had to work. I have a oral surgery appointment later this afternoon, so I was going to work. But I called them. I said, I'm not coming in, so I'm here. So
I really appreciate
had to
that,
throw
Gary.
things together.
Thank you for being here with us.
Now, thank you for inviting us. Thank you for having all these wonderful people here. So we're the Winnemem Wintu tribe, Middle Water people. You can click the next slide. And our chief is Chief Colleen Sis. She's not only our chief, she's our chief and spiritual leader. She is the 5th leader of the tribe in succession, lineal succession, since California became a state in 1850, whenever that was. So it's a direct lineage. We've had our own government all through the existing of California, but unfortunately, we're not a federally recognized tribe, but we are a tribe recognized by the state of California. Next slide, please. In our Winnemem, our homeland is the upper Sacramento River watershed, which includes the Sacramento River, McCloud River, Pitt River, Squaw Creek. And I have a picture of it up there now, and it's with the lake because the lake kind of impedes our traditional homeland now. Our traditional tribal land actually went below where the dam is now, down to past Kennett, a little farther down past Redding. You had Norelmilk to the west, Puisu to the east, Namtipom down to the bottom of us, El Palm, Winnemem, Da Palm. But that's our main territory that is undisputed by all the tribes around us, so I can show that. Next slide, please. So our origin story, as in who we are, is our origin story is that we came from a spring on Mount Shasta. That we came out of the spring, we were formed from the spring, and I know some people look at that origin story as like, how can you become from a spring? But it's no different than being created from somebody else's rib. I mean, it's a creation story, how you became as a human being, as a soul. And we came out of the spring, but we were pretty weak, pretty non-sustainable. We kind of wandered around and looked at things, and we couldn't speak. And all of the other spirits had come before us. We had elk come before us, bear come before us, spider, squirrel, chipmunk, all those came before us, and salmon came before us too. And we were the last ones to come out of the mountain, the human spirit. And Creator looked down and said, man, these guys are going to need a lot of help because we look pretty pitiful. And salmon came back to us and they said, well, we're going to help them out. We're going to give them our voice so that they can speak and communicate with the other spirits and other people. And so salmon gave us their voice. Salmon to us is called Nur. And Ladada Nur is ancestral Nur, the grandfather Nur. So salmon gave us their voice so that we could speak for them. And so we promised to always speak for salmon in return that they have promised to always feed, nurture us, and take care of us through eternity or until they die out and we die. We believe that when the last salmon is gone, the Winnemem will be gone also. Next slide, please. Go ahead, click on it. So who are we? Click on it. Winnem, Mem, Wintu. Click on it. Winna means middle, Mem means water, Wintu means people. So that kind of says how we are related to water, because that's what we are as water people. And the Winnemem, Winnemem is actually the name of the McCloud River in Winnemem. It's Winnemem-Waiwakat, and it's the middle river water. And what is a beneficial use? We'll talk about that in a minute. And our beneficial use is only important to humans. Well, we don't believe so. But before we get there, a historical point is that 18 treaties with California tribes were hidden away by order of Secretary of Secrecy in the U.S. Senate executive session in June 8, 1852, and were never ratified. And these were done, this was done in the U.S. Senate on the request of California legislatures. They did not want them to ratify the treaties because they did not want to share the resources. They wanted to make sure that we didn't have any rights. We didn't have any resources. Next slide, please. And this is all relevant for a few things because we're getting down to some of those reasons. Reasons why that was important is because with the treaties not ratified, we were not federally recognized. We were not assigned a reservation or a rancheria because those treaties guaranteed us a 35 square mile reservation on the McCloud River that touched the McCloud, Sacramento, and Pitt River. We would have had land. We would have had sustenance. We would have had all those things. But the failure to ratify those treaties took that away. And in so doing, we were kind of left out there in the wind. And in 1940s, the Bureau of Reclamation, through an act of Congress called the CVP Indian Lands Acquisition Act, and for other purposes, which authorized the Bureau of Reclamation to take any native land that was in their way for any Central Valley project, was passed, and Bureau of Reclamation began building Shasta Dam. Next slide, please. Well, as they built Shasta Dam and it filled and the lake became a lake, as you can see, that is an actual picture from 1947. They didn't move us off anywhere. They just came in and bulldozed our houses and let the water flood the homes. We lost over 90% of our homeland, sacred sites, cultural gathering sites. The dam blocked the salmon from returning to their traditional spawning grounds in the cold waters of the McCloud. And we were pretty much left homeless. And the unfortunate thing is that we had grandfathers and grandmothers that were serving in the armed forces, serving the United States, this country, over in Europe and in the Pacific theater, fighting World War II. And when they came home, this is what they came home to. The CVP and Indian Lands Acquisition Act had some clauses in it that said that they were supposed to give us compensation for the land, but they didn't do that. It said that they were supposed to give us like land, but they didn't do that. And it said that they were supposed to move all of our burials and put them into a site and name the cemetery in the name of the tribe or the family, as the case may be. Well, they moved all of the burials based on Florence Jones, who was our leader at that time, pointed out where the village burials were. They were all Winnemem Wintu people. There was 183 that was moved and disinterred and reinterred in a place which was then Central Valley. It's called Black Canyon. But they named the cemetery the Shasta Reservoir Indian Cemetery, and we're still trying to figure out who the Shasta Reservoir Indians were or are, because them naming that the Shasta Reservoir Indian Cemetery also denied us the ability to gain federal recognition and get some land back as a reservation, because we didn't have any assets in trust in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The way the Bureau of Indian Affairs designated federally recognized tribes is that first, all of the treaty tribes that had been ratified, they of course were put on their federally recognized list. Then they looked at all of the assets that were held in trust and who those were assigned to and what the names were. And then those tribes or even those families were put on the federally recognized list. And then some of the tribes that have gone by congressional decree since then have been added to the list. And some of them by court decree have been added to the list. Some of the rancherias that were done years ago, I'm not going to go through all the laws, they were put in place and then they were taken away. And then they were finally reestablished again. And they actually got put on the list, thank goodness. But there are about 120 unrecognized tribes in the state of California that are not federally recognized. And it's because of the lack of those treaties. Next slide, please. I'm just trying to give you some background here a little bit. So Shasta Dam blocked the salmon from returning to their native habitat, their historical spawning grounds. The winter run Chinook salmon are unique to all fish in the world, is that they need really, really cold water in order to spawn in. They go the highest of any fish when they do their travel back to their historical habitat. The winter run salmon came all the way up the Bay Delta, all the way up to the base of Mount Shasta, up the McCloud River, jumped up the three falls that are there, and it went up the creeks, and they spawned back in the traditional days. But with the dam, of course, blocked them so they couldn't get there anymore. But they don't give up. They continue to migrate up the river. They try to get up there. They still beat their head against the cement. And there's been efforts to reintroduce them. And that's our efforts are coming a little bit later in what beneficial uses are. Next slide, please. So the Bureau of Reclamation proposed to raise the height of Shasta Dam. That was re-put on the plate again by the CalFed Bay Delta Authority in 2000. And when we heard of that, we started screaming again because it had been killed. It had been laid to rest, and then all of a sudden it was revised again. Next slide, please. When we heard of that, this was their two proposals at the time, 6.5 feet and 18.5 feet. 6.5 feet will flood sacred sites on the McLeod we still use today. The 18.5 feet will 18.5 feet raised will actually flood all the sacred sites we have left access to on the McLeod River that we still use today. So we're getting ready to pay a price again just for being Winnemem Wintu and just for being in the area if this dam raise is allowed to go ahead. And you guys have a part of a say in that because you see you hold water rights that the Bureau of Reclamation has to petition you for and reestablish for. And I probably have to do that for additional footage. Next slide. I just thought I'd throw that out there. So the sites that would disappear if it was enlarged is the Girls Puberty Rock, where our coming ages ceremony is held. This is the only one that's left. There used to be 20 or 30 of them on the river, all up and down the river, but this is the only one that's left. Children's Rock this is the only Children's Rock that is left. And what they do is they begin their path, they swim out to the middle of the water. There's some holes in the rock. They put their faith in sticking their holes in the darkness to see what they feel and come away with a little bit of strength. The rest of the burial sites would be gone, including the massacre of Kaibay Creek, which 48 Winnemem were killed there by miners and vigilantes, came out of Redding. Decca ceremonial grounds, village sites, medicine gathering sites, and many other cultural resources if they flooded this. Next slide, please. So when we heard about this, we held a war dance at Shasta Dam in 2004. It was the first war dance that was held by the tribe in 150 years. The first war dance was held on the McLeod River when they were building the Baird Fish Hatchery. And that was because we thought the Baird Fish Hatchery was going to be a bad thing, but they made a deal with us. And so we supported the Baird Fish Hatchery because they told us that it was a reservation. So we thought it was an Indian reservation, but it turned out to only be a fish reservation. But some good things came out of that. Eggs went to New Zealand and established salmon runs over New Zealand. Next slide, please. I wonder who that is. Next slide, please. So these were some of the headlines back there in 2004 that didn't look very good for us. Dianne Feinstein, of course, helped push this CalFed funding bill through. Congress passed the CalFed water bill, which made money for the enlargement of Shasta Dam, and CalFed bill ready for Bush's okay, and of course he okayed it. Next slide, please. So our war dance hit the news media and went all across the world. We got calls from Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Russia, China even, can you believe this? About us doing a war dance on the Shasta Dam. And the one big call that we got from that was from New Zealand saying, hey, we've got your fish here. And so that started a long process. And I won't go into all of that now because that's a whole another slide. But next slide, please. But even with all of that going on in the proposed raising of Shasta Dam and us being not federally recognized and us really not having a homeland other than a ranch with 42.5 acres, ceremony still goes on, and we still have a coming ages ceremony. And this is what's important about tribal beneficial uses and beneficial uses in the first place. In order to hold a coming of age ceremony, the Winnemem Wintu need water. They need access to water. They need access to clean water. Because if you see that picture there on the right-hand side in the middle, that's a grinding rock. All of the herbs and things that are used in that ceremony are gathered all up and down this river, the McLeod River, for that ceremony. And if you see the river there in those two bark huts, you see that the bark huts are on one side of the river. And if you look on by that rock there, there's another side of the river. And how this ceremony works is the girls go to those bark huts and they meditate for 4 days. And they learn how to become women, the ways of the tribe from the older women. They go and they talk and they counsel them. They go through steps to becoming womanhood, those kind of things. And after the 4 days, they have to swim across the river to the main camp where the dancers and everything are. So we definitely need access to water, clean water. And I would say that that would be a tribal beneficial use, would you? And that tribal beneficial use is not only exclusive to the Winnemem, all up and down the Sacramento River, McLeod Rivers, Pitt Rivers, Tuolumne Rivers, Cosumnes Rivers, San Joaquin Rivers, everywhere there's a tribe, they have a ceremony or ceremonies that are similar or the same or that are deal with water and access to water and the need to be part of it, because that's part of the culture. Not just part of the culture, that's part of the religion. That's a religious practice. Next slide, please. But even with ceremony going on, we have a struggle. We have, since we're not a federally recognized tribe, we can't close off the river. We have people that come up. The video that you would have saw was people coming up saying foul language to the girls in the huts and the people on the other side, and even one woman in a boat flashing us and those kind of things. And those are the kind of things that we deal with, and we deal with every time we have this ceremony, because there's really no designation for tribal use of water anywhere. The Shasta County Sheriff's has jurisdiction on the water. The U.S. Forest Service has jurisdiction at the water line around the land, and the Bureau of Reclamation owns the water basically by the water permit. But in order for us to have a coming of age ceremony, it takes months of negotiation to try and just get a permit so that we can go and have a ceremony so these girls can have the coming of age. I didn't bring some other slides. Up the river where this boat is heading, there's some sacred pools of water. There's a mountain above there. It's called Universe Rock. And the men go up there for 4 days and they do their fasting. And we look to see what we can learn. And after the 4 days, we come down off the mountain and we get into those pools. And those pools cleanse us, and the spirits look us over and they decide whether or not we're a good person or not. And when we come out of that water, we need to go and talk to the tribal leaders and let them know what we saw, what we felt, what we heard. So that's another tribal beneficial use. It's tribal beneficial use. I mean, it's culture. I mean, it's you can't separate it. It's religion. It's our way of life. Next slide, please. Then we have the survival of the endangered California winter wren Chinook salmon. Now, the Chinook salmon used to be the main sustenance of the Winnemem Wintu. When Livingston Stone had his fish hatchery on Baird, there was one July day that he counted 250,000 salmon coming past the hatchery. That's one day. That tells you what the salmon populations were back then. And this is, of course, this is 70s, 1875. So, a lot's happened since then. A few world wars, a few plagues, kind of things like that. Those things happen. But that's what the salmon were, and the salmon sustained the minimum throughout the year. We had salmon for lunch, salmon for breakfast, salmon for dinner, salmon, we had salmon. But we still love salmon. Next slide, please. And what we're trying to do to get the salmon back is every year for the last 6-7 years, we've had a run for salmon. And what this has done is try to bring awareness to the public about what the plight is of the salmon and what's going on. The first 4 years was going from the Mount Shasta down to the Delta. That was the salmon's migration out. The next 4 years was coming from the Delta back up to the McLeod River, and this is the 4th year of that part of the run. And that has brought big awareness to the salmon. And our cultural resources include salmon, which is not limited to the McLeod River. It goes from the Bay Delta, the Pacific Ocean, all the way up to the McLeod River, and from the McLeod River all the way down to the ocean. So we have an interest in what happens with water flows, protection of salmon, all the way up and down the Sacramento River. And there are many things that are on board now that are going to further, we believe, further endanger salmon, if not send them into extinction altogether. Next slide, please. One of the things we're trying to do to help bring the salmon back is, for the first time in 80 years, eyed salmon eggs were placed in the McLeod River. This was in conjunction with NOAA Fisheries and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They brought in 20,000 endangered salmon eggs. We put them in the McLeod River so that they could hatch. CFDW took care of them, had the hatchery there, watched them, nurtured them, was there 24/7, and the hatchery went down. DWR, I believe it is, had the juvenile capture facilities down at the bottom where we captured them, took those salmon out and put them in the Sacramento River. Next slide, please. And what we're doing is we're praying that these salmon remember the waters. So we hope so. Next slide, please. This was part of the big ceremony when this happened. It was done twice. We put 20,000 in once, and then a month later, another 20,000 in. And officers and individuals from 3-4 different agencies were there in support. Federal agencies, state agencies. It was a wonderful thing, and this is the incubation system that they put up. Next slide, please. And as a result of that, in May of this year, we signed a co-management agreement on the McLeod River with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and NOAA to begin reintroduction and manage the reintroduction of salmon into the McLeod River. How's that for history? Next slide, please. Now, I want to finish it up by saying that if you saw those slides and you looked at what was going on all the way down, you can see why it's important for not only tribal beneficial uses to be designated, but it's also important for you, the State Water Resources Control Board, to become a steward of those salmon. We're trying to get them back into the river, but they're not going to survive, not with a tunnel going in, not with another dam that's off-site that you have to take 1.5 million acre-feet of water off of the Sacramento River to the side, not with voluntary agreements that are voluntary. I mean, that's like the managed agreement they have on the Shasta coal water pool. It went from a designated coal water pool of 1.2 million acres to a managed one. And guess what happened after that was designated as managed? They had 1.2 million acres extra of water exported out of Shasta Dam every year after that. I can show you the statistics and prove it to you. And of course, we had salmon die-offs every time after that. We trust you to take care of the public trust. The public trust includes all people, not just tribes, but it includes salmon and all species up and down the river. Beneficial uses are for species. Beneficial uses are for creation. All my relations. Thank you.
You're incredibly, Gary.
Well, good morning, everybody. I also have some slides, if you could pull those up. My name's Emily Maloney. I'm the Water Program Coordinator for Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, and I'm a staff in the Natural Resources Department, and happy to be here to present on behalf of the tribe and share some of our views on tribal beneficial uses, what that means to Buena Vista Rancheria, and how that relates to flows. And also, I just want to, acknowledge Rhonda Morningstar Pope, our chairwoman of Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, a direct ancestor in the lineage of Miwok and Yokut people. And I also want to thank, the tribal elders, our staff, who's helped educate me on the importance of Miwok culture, the practices, the stories, and I'll be kind of weaving some of that into my presentation along with some of the more Western science that we also use at Buena Vista Rancheria. So next slide, please. So my focus today is to, provide an introduction to water and river ecosystems, answer the question of what are tribal beneficial uses from a tribal perspective, the significance of those TBUs, and talk about how they relate to flows, and give a suggestion for kind of flow management. Next slide. So this map is not intended to show the ancestral territory of Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, but it is here to talk about some of the area of interest, our watersheds that we are invested in and care about. The tribe's land is located in southwestern Amador County. That's where the reservation land is, and that is in the McCallamy River watershed. You can see the McCallamy River watershed in there, flowing toward Lodi, and then it draining into the southern part of the delta. So Buena Vista Rancheria is caretakers, they're water people. So they're caretakers of the McCallamy River. They have connection to the lower San Joaquin River in the southern part of the delta as well. Next slide. So just to share some things that I've been told from Miwok elders, from the tribal community, is that water is life. And the Miwok word for water is kiku. But kiku is life. Kiku is a relation. Kiku connects us. Past, present, future, upstream, downstream, below ground, above ground. All kiku is connected. All water is connected. Next slide, please. And there's concepts, right, from the scientific world that remind us of this, that all water is one water from the beginning. It's cycling across the earth, through the earth, from the ocean up to the sky, back down to the mountains, into the earth. It's groundwater, seeping out of springs, feeding our rivers. So this water is constantly cycling. It's all one water. It's all connected. Next slide. So just another concept. This is the river continuum concept. And this is a really interesting idea because it reminds us that, these are integrated systems. Rivers, watersheds are integrated systems from the headwaters all the way down to the ocean where they connect to that ocean. So what happens upstream affects downstream, and what happens downstream affects upstream. And all of these areas within the watershed have a role for contributing. And just to provide an example to kind of understand, how impacts, how things that we do in the watershed affect, what we do upstream can affect downstream and vice versa. I'll just use the example of a dam because I can easily describe both sides. So when you think about a dam on a river, the purpose of that dam, there's many purposes, but one of the main purposes is to store water, right? For various uses. So that dam is constructed, it's storing water behind it. But as that water flows down, it's also carrying sediment and other materials. So we have sediment, gravels, cobbles, boulders that are getting locked up behind that dam. And that sediment is not allowed to carry downstream to nourish our floodplains, to build islands, to build our deltas, to raise up that land to support wetlands. So we're losing vital parts, components of our ecosystems in that process. So that sediment is deprived in a lot of rivers. And so to kind of give the example of what happens downstream affects upstream, well, with the same case of the dam, as we've just been talking about the salmon life cycle, if we have adult salmon down in the ocean who are ready to migrate upstream, they are migrating upstream to their home river, their natal streams, to lay their eggs, die, pass on their generation to the next generation. Well, they run into that dam. And in most cases, they're not able to get up and above that dam. And fish need to give their gifts to the watershed, to the whole watershed, all the way up, as far as they can go. And those salmon are, laying their eggs. They're going to die in that stream, and they're going to give their nutrition, their nutrients, their bodies to the environment, to the next generation of salmon even, because their bodies become food for insects, which then feed the young salmon and help them grow and make their migration downstream. But also they're feeding the other wildlife in the area. Imagine a bear who's going into that river, grabbing a salmon, bringing it back into the forest. And then now you have salmon who are feeding forests, right? And giving their nutrition to those environments as well. So what we do downstream affects what we do upstream as well. So that's that river continuum concept. It's an integrated system. Next slide. A little bit more on kind of functions of these ecosystems. And that river continuum concept really talks about the longitudinal connectivity, right? The river is connected along its length from upstream to downstream. And there's things that disrupt this longitudinal connectivity, right? We just talked about one of them, dams. But there's also lateral connectivity. Rivers and water need to move laterally. They need to move side to side in the banks, right? We have riparian areas. We have adjacent wetlands. We have floodplains, right? So that water needs to connect laterally, side to side. Also, it needs to connect vertically. So our groundwater, surface water connections, our soil water that's connecting to the atmosphere through trees and other vegetation, and the evapotranspiration that allows that water to move back and forth from the soil to the sky. So these are actions that need to happen and do happen in healthy functioning rivers. But when you have levees that are straitjacketing rivers, you're decreasing the ability to have lateral connectivity. And that's not just water, moving side to side, but it's also the river's ability to move and meander, sinuosity, a meandering river, not a straight river. Right, next slide, please. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the significance of TBUs and their recognition. So next slide. We saw these definitions earlier and in the presentation by the Water Board staff. So I'm not going to read these because you've seen them, but these are the tribal beneficial use definitions. And I just want to acknowledge, the decade of work that went into creating these and the tribes that really pushed for that. and also the tribal nonprofit organizations that were involved in that, and really making sure the language that is in these definitions was accurate. You know, when we look at this and we say uses of water that support the cultural, spiritual, ceremonial, or traditional rights or lifeways of California Native American tribes, that's it. The lifeways, that's huge, that's everything. Next slide, please. But from a tribal perspective, I mean, water itself is significant. At Buena Vista, the elders have shared with me, I've heard this in story, but water is an entity with a life of its own. It needs to move. It has its own purpose, irrespective of us, and it needs to move in and out of different states in order to express itself and to heal the world. It's a relative, it's a relation who connects all things. It transports stories across time and space. It stores memories. It's a teacher and a guide. It's a cleaning agent. And there are entities, right? These could be spirits associated with water. These are plants and plant communities that are associated with water. The Tule people, the Willow people, the Cottonwood people, the fish people, right? And there's families, actual people who are associated with water and are caretakers of water. And actually our chairwoman is one of those. So water itself is significant. Next slide. So tribal beneficial uses, you know, this is a means of recognizing, right, the interconnection, the interrelatedness, ecosystems and culture. They are interconnected and interdependent, right? Buena Vista Miwok and Yokut ancestry, I forgot to mention in the beginning, it's a mixed ancestry tribe of Northern Yokut and Northern Sierra Nevada Miwok people. Their identity and personhood is integrally tied to the waterways and the ecosystems. And without these things, you know, it affects the tribal lifeways. You know, we need the willow, the tule, the rocks, the river itself, the soil, the birds, the amphibians. They're all part of it. They're all important and they're all intrinsically honored for their own gifts, but also the gifts that they give for the people. So these things are integrated and interconnected. Next slide. So cultural uses of and relating to water and water-dependent resources. You know, you heard how there are ceremonies that are linked, and I'm kind of just lumping things here into these categories. But everything has a role, right? That we talked about, and the waterways supply many things for life, right? You need water to drink, to bathe, to sustain your village. But think of the river and its ecosystems as, you know, a garden or a grocery store where you're tending and gathering food. You know, your pharmacy where there's medicines, your hardware store where you're getting building materials, maybe your workshop where you're milling and grinding seeds or acorns. So you need these places, right? The river is also a place of worship, a place where there's ceremony, or you're gathering water and bringing it to a ceremony. So of course, these are sort of the categories, right? The sustenance, the materials, the health, that are all connected to these tribal beneficial uses, the cultural uses relating to water. And these, you know, can happen in the water, under the water. You know, if you're swimming, holding your breath, these can happen on top of the water if you're boating down a river. Adjacent to, it's including those wetlands that are nearby, those backwater ponds. Those are all part of this from a tribal perspective. Next slide. So this is some of the Buena Vista Natural Resources staff. We were out on one of our gathering sites, a creek that feeds into the McCollum River, and we were out working with willow. So willow is a very important species to the tribe, you know, used for basket material, building material. It's used to build the sweat lodge on the reservation. And it has a life of its own as well. It has songs and stories to tell. But we are out there working with the willow, harvesting that willow so we could actually do a restoration project. And we're bringing that willow in to kind of help buffer an area on our pond, which is also, we call this pond a cultural use area. And so it's part of, our restoration efforts as well. Next slide. So why are these TBU designations significant? Well, tribal uses have been disrupted, and they've been disrupted by settler colonization, genocide, land use disruption, privatization, land modification, water rights issues, and pollution. That's a huge disruption. Access rights to water. So tribal beneficial uses, tribal uses of water, they're dependent on the relations. And these uses are essentially the historic uses, right? The kind of original human uses of water in California. And that kind of leads me, to my next point of we're asking the Water Board to recognize this disruption. And we're asking, the Water Board to protect these uses because they still exist and are currently being revitalized. The next slide. So TBUs, they're the mechanism, right? They're the mechanism to help support and protect these activities, tribal activities. And so we're asking, again, that TBUs be adopted into the Bay Delta Plan to support these uses, cultural uses, tribal subsistence fishing uses. And again, recognize, this is important, that TBUs are diverse in the way that tribes are applying these and what they mean to different tribes across the state. So they're going to be applied differently for tribes on different waterways. And so the Water Board's going to need to recognize that as well. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how flows and TBUs are connected. And I'm going to, spend a few slides on this and tell a few stories. But flows are the master variable. They drive the geomorphic, the biological, the chemical processes that are important for aquatic ecosystems. There's a ton of scientific literature on this. And the aquatic, or the flows are that master variable. So aquatic ecosystems support wildlife, fish, vegetation used in tribal traditional lifeways. And those aquatic ecosystems support they create and support the physical structures and places for gathering and ceremony. You need that flow to move sediment and create floodplains, which over time might become terraces, which might be village sites, right? You have rocks for fishing on, having ceremony, grinding acorns, processing acorns. You have your travel routes. Next slide. So I want to use this model that I developed to continue to explain how flows are connected, right? Flows are instrumental to the geomorphic processes, the physical habitat. Flows are instrumental to providing the biological cues for, plants and wildlife. They're also instrumental for chemical nutrient processing, for good water quality or poor water quality, depending on what's going on. And when those things are intact, we can get tribal beneficial uses from that. And I'm going to give two stories, and the first one is about cottonwood and how cottonwood relies on flows in order to reproduce. And essentially, in a natural river system, you have flow variability. And for a cottonwood, you need that initial big peak flow, like you get that big rain event, right? That causes the rivers to rise. And in that event, those rivers are moving sediment. That's the geomorphic process, right? They're moving that sediment. They're cleaning the gravels of old algae that's built up or old, sediment that's in the way. They're cleaning those, right? The cleaning agent. And also they're laying down new sediments. So cottonwood needs that because so it needs that peak flow to expose the bare mineral soil. And then around this time, the cottonwoods are flowering right now. And we're also having our snow melt coming down the rivers. So the cottonwoods are flowering and the air is carrying their seeds, but also the water is distributing their seeds, kind of letting them settle out in that bare mineral soil that those earlier peak flows helped create. So now those seeds are deposited. So over time, later on, as those flows start depleting, as the flows go down, those cottonwood seeds are germinating. And their roots are actually going to follow that water as it recedes down into the soil until it can tap into that water table and help that cottonwood survive, right? So that's the flow component to the life cycle of a cottonwood. But now if you have cottonwoods that are regenerating, now you have cottonwoods that you can use, right? You have cottonwoods that are your building material. You have cottonwoods that provide medicine. You have cottonwoods that inside those cottonwoods, they have really nice fibers that are perfect for carrying fire. And so those are those cultural uses of that plant that relies on flows. Next slide, please. Now, this is essentially, you can use this model to describe basically anything, right? We just talked about cottonwood. You could describe it with tule, but we could describe it with salmon. And salmon are an ecological and cultural keystone species, meaning that this species holds together seemingly disparate things or ideas. And salmon give more than they take from the ecosystem. And I told you earlier about how salmon are connected to forests. So I don't need to explain that, but they're holding things together, right? And you know, the McCallamy River is named for a very specific reason. That is a Miwok name. McCallamy, it means fishnet, people of the fishnet. So the McCallamy River was a significant place for fishing for Miwok people. And a lot of the fishing villages and a lot of the fishing sites are now under Pardee or Comanche Reservoir and are no longer accessible. And of course, those reservoirs have dams that are blocking fish passage. Of course, there is a very effective hatchery on that watershed, on that river. But the McCallamy River, it's significant. And these fish are significant to that area, and they need flows. So just to kind of quickly talk about this, those flows cue salmon migrations, right? You need flows also for the habitat components for the salmon. You need flows to carve in, scour pools. You need flows to deposit gravel beds for their spawning. You need flows to build floodplains. You also need those flows to get on the floodplain so that the young of year salmon can actually eat bugs, get big and strong so they can migrate out to the ocean and survive. You need that hydrologic connectivity from top to bottom to enable the migration up and down in all life cycles of that fish. You need adequate water quality. You need the proper pH. You need the proper dissolved oxygen. You need cold temperatures. So all of this is connected to flows to have a successful life history of salmon. All right, next slide. So now what? The Bay Delta watershed consists of rivers that have been largely dammed and have their water allocated entirely in some instances or over allocated for human use. We're altering flow regimes, we're impairing water quality, changing sediment processes, geomorphic processes of these rivers, and we are out of balance. We need to restore balance with our ecosystems and these ecosystems that our livelihoods depend on, all of us. So rivers need to be able to function in their ecological capacity because it's the rivers themselves that support tribal beneficial uses and other human uses. So TBUs and other biological or ecological beneficial uses or goals need to be developed and implemented to bring us back into balance. And one of the tools that I want to share with you in the next slide, you can switch slides, is about functional flows. There's a paper, 2015 Yarnell, that describes this. And I highly recommend you all get your hands on that paper. But essentially, it describes what functional flows are. Functional flows are the attempt to reflect the natural patterns of flow variability. And the TEK, Buena Vista TEK, would agree with that because we would say that we need to mimic flows, mimic natural flows. And the functional flow concept is that you mimic natural flows to support the geomorphic processes, to support the biological processes, the ecosystem processes that then provide for the cultural practices to occur. So we need to have a natural hydrograph. We need to have a natural hydrograph that has the variability, the peak flows. So that hydrograph there on the left is kind of showing a modeled river, right? A natural, and it's showing functional flow regime for like a Mediterranean montane climate river. So very relevant to our Sierra Nevada rivers. And this idea that you have these peak flows, you have these kind of sustained spring flows, and then you have your spring runoff peak. And then you have this tapering down into this dry season base flow. And all this variation, like the native plants and animals are adapted to this. It's when things get homogenized across a watershed that non-native species, non-native fish come in and can really impair the situations, or native fish can't survive in those conditions. So we need these variations in order to replicate these for beneficial uses. So next slide. You don't necessarily, need like unimpaired flow concepts, and you don't need the same amount of water every year, right? You can mimic dry years, wet years, but you do need enough flow to trigger the function, right? The processes that are involved to move sediment, to have biological cues, and floodplain inundation. And these have to be timed properly, like in sync with the natural cycles, when that initial rainfall would be occurring, right? When the spring runoff is occurring. And there's a really great local case study, right, with Puta Creek, and the kind of the mandated legal action that caused operators to change flows. And on that creek, they modified dam operations to implement a natural flow regime. And this was studied by local scientists, including Dr. Peter Moyle out of UC Davis. The paper is cited as Kiernan et al. 2012, but it was a 17-year study. And it studied conditions of native fish assemblages before the implementation of the natural flow regime, and it studied them 8 years after, 9 years after. And what it showed is that when they were operating that dam to mimic the natural flow regime on Puta Creek, that you were actually able to have more intact native fish assemblages. Of course, the non-native species were still there. Their sources, right? They're in Lake Berryessa. They can get flushed down at any point in time. They're part of that system. But it's a matter of you're creating the variability that supports native fishes and those native fish populations. And that research really shows that. So again, something to kind of put your eyes to. So that kind of concludes that component of my presentation. And if you go to the next slides, I just have kind of my recommendations, because I'm used to coming to these and just kind of reading my prepared statements and then that being it. But thank you for this opportunity to provide this level of presentation to you all. But again, reiterating, adopting TBUs into this Bay Delta plan for flows. I hope this presentation has kind of really laid a good framework for understanding why it's important. But I have to reiterate this continued consultation, with all, sorry, there's a typo, but all governments, tribal people, tribal governments, and also engage the tribal nonprofit organizations. They're instrumental as well. There's tribal nonprofits that actually do water quality monitoring, and they have useful information. State Water Board tribal coordinators and tribal liaisons need to be communicating. and bringing tribes to the table for these discussions. Like, for example, if you're going to be creating voluntary agreements, those voluntary agreements need to have tribes at the table. Because if we don't have a water right that's being acknowledged, we would have, the tribes would have on a watershed. They were the original water users. They were first in time, first in right, essentially. They need to be at that table. So, also working directly with tribes and assisting where feasible with capacity, because every tribe is in a different place in terms of their government and their access to resources. So in order to kind of, maybe the water board can really help and recognize that there are capacity issues, and you might be asking a lot of tribes in some of these situations, but tribes do want to engage. Next slide. I also want to recommend that, you relate flows to water quality objectives for the various rivers. And that, meaning flows and water quality are connected. We're going to have the regional water boards, in charge of water quality, but flows and water quality are related. So those need to talk to each other. Also acknowledge that tribal uses of water are the water uses of since time immemorial. Acknowledge that all aspects of aquatic ecosystems need flow and require the natural hydrograph with that flow variability. And work with water right holders, dam operators to make this happen. And I already said it, but tribes as well. And considering that functional flow regime. And that also needs to be looked at river by river. The Bay Delta watershed is enormous. You already know that. We all know that. But we have to look at river by river because each river is going to have its own story, its own heartbeat, right? Its own hydrograph. And all those rivers are going to be highly modified. But that Yarnell 2015 paper talks about highly modified rivers and implementation of functional flows on there. So it's a very useful reference. Next slide. So that is my presentation. I, again, just want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks is ours as well. Really appreciate the thorough presentation, Ms. Maloney. And just we'll have further comment and conversation, but we'll keep going down through the panel. So just thank you. Chair Moreno.
I'm actually not the chair. I am the tech program manager for Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. However, thank you for reminding me because I do want to offer on behalf of Vice Chair Melissa Tayaba her regards. She couldn't be here today, although she really wanted to. So I'm here to offer some comments on behalf of the Shingle Strings Band. And now I'm kicking myself for not having gone first after my colleagues' two fantastic presentations. But I want to back up and say, first of all, thank you, Chair Esquivel and board members for giving us the space. We talked to many different agencies and entities, and one of the talking points that we always try to underscore is the importance of tribal voices at every table where decisions are being made impacting tribes. So again, thank you for providing the space. I do also want to offer a welcome, and if this was done before I got here, I apologize, but we'll just do it again. Where we sit today are the unceded ancestral homelands of the Nisin-Pawanan people, which are the ancestral homelands connected to the Shingle Springs tribe. A little bit about the tribe, which some of you may not know. The name Shingle Springs can be misleading at times because what's missing is the explanation around removal and the fact that the tribe has been removed from its ancestral homelands, which span actually 7 California counties, Sacramento being a main one. So village sites, range anywhere from, down into the Bay Delta region, up to the crest of the Sierras and, even further through the Bear River, confluence of the Feather, confluence of the Sacramento. And so ancestral territory is vast. We have interest in all of the watersheds that it contains, and which is why we're here today. Tribal beneficial uses. It's so critical that you include TBUs in your next Bay Delta Plan update. Tribes are impacted in different ways than other populations of people. We are very unique in the way that we utilize the river. We are very unique in the way that we are connected to the river and everything it touches, the land, the natural resources, the plants, the animals, because we have a deep reciprocal responsibility to take care of it in the way that it's taken care of us from the beginning of time, as Emily mentioned. We go down to ancestral village sites. We're trying to conduct cultural revitalization, and part of my job is to do that. Part of our job in our tech department is to take the youth, to take elders down to ancestral village sites and help restore that connection that was once there. And the connection really didn't go away, right? This is just a coming full circle, being able to come back, being able to access. And sometimes we cannot access major village sites, but we do our best. You know, we have to be very creative about how we gain access, you know, and whether it's MOUs or whether it's, you know, different agreements. It's so critical that we connect our tribal members back to their ancestral village sites. Having said that, the challenge that we have is when we go back down and we're trying to gather, whether it's for Thule, for basketry, or maybe it's our tech summer internship program where we're taking our tribal youth down to show them the entire process of gathering Thule or willow or the other materials that it takes to construct a traditional Thule boat, or maybe it's a Thule house. And by the way, we do these things seasonally, right? Because again, it's part of that reconnection to culture, to place, to identity. Not just our youth, our elders. Another example, basketry, right? So the way that we are touching these plants, the way that we are ingesting and engaging with water and the landscapes is very different, I think, than other populations of people. And so we have to consider the way that those things can impact just our human health overall, right? So the other day, I was, you know, twining some Thule. I'm putting the Thule in my mouth. I'm touching it with my hands. But I can do that because now I'm growing Thule in tubs outside of my home, and I know that it's safe for me to do that. I can't say that for the areas that we take our youth and our elders to. So to that point, what Shingle Springs has done, because this is of critical importance to us, when we're taking our tribal members back to these places, we can't take them somewhere where we don't believe the water quality is safe. We cannot do that because part of our responsibility is to protect our communities. So what we've done, and we're so grateful and we're so fortunate that we have a tribal council that supports the work that we're doing. We have started a water quality monitoring program. It's just getting started, but we know that it's necessary because the health of our tribal members is of key importance. We want to encourage the state board, we want to encourage other state agencies to really think about, as Emily talked about, the way that tribes are under-resourced. And so we have an obligation to protect ourselves and our tribal members, and we also feel that the water board has an obligation to ensure and protect the quality of water and the ways that we are utilizing it. So again, just another plug for other tribes that may not have the resources that we have that are utilizing the water and those resources in the same way that we are. The other thing is fish consumption. So when we talk about ceremony, Gary talked a lot about ceremony. We all have ceremony. We all conduct it in different ways. We just did a Salmon People ceremony gathering. When was that, Castile? About 3 weeks ago. Okay, and it was a gathering in Verona, which is in Sutter County, and that is a newly acquired piece of land that the tribe was able to purchase and to reacquire because it is also actually a village site connected to the tribe. So we were able to hold ceremony there. We had people from many different tribes inside California and out with all the same purpose, coming together, telling their stories around salmon, around protecting the waters, around keeping ourselves healthy. And it was what we needed. The land needed it, the water needed it. Part of that ceremony was feeding the river because we know the river's not healthy and we know that we need to help bring that back. So we understand our role and responsibility there, and we just want to keep encouraging the water board to do what you can to help us in those efforts. What can you do to include tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan? Not only that, but to take an all waters approach to designations, and then to implement water quality standards and objectives in a way that is adequate to protect the ways that we use the water. What else do I have? When the water quality is not up to standard, it impedes our ability to practice culture. And I don't say this lightly. When we can no longer practice culture, we are facing cultural genocide. We've already been through too much as Native people. We already survived once. We shouldn't have to do it again. So we're leaning on you, we're asking you to uphold your responsibility to ensure water quality standards that meet the needs of the tribes.
Thank you so much, Ms. Moreno.
Good morning.
Morning.
Is that loud enough? Okay. I'm Casil Willie. I'm the staff attorney for Save California Salmon, but I'm also Paiute, Pomo, Wailaki, and Wintu. I want to thank my tribal partners first for those sharing those really powerful comments. They're very impactful, and I really appreciate that them sharing those histories and their culture with us. First, I would like to thank the board for considering tribal beneficial uses for the Bay Delta Plan. Last year, I was here asking if TBUs would be covered by the Bay Delta Plan, and now they are. So I really appreciate the quick response from the board on this matter. That being said, consideration is not adoption or implementation. Tribes have been and will continue to advocate for the inclusion of TBUs, not only in the Bay Delta Plan, but regionally as well. But the Bay Delta Plan is a culturally important watershed. The board needs to hear and take the advice from tribes when it comes to protecting resources that have been important to tribes and tribal communities since time immemorial. Tribes deserve to have their traditions protected. For tribes, the Bay Delta and all connected water systems have been an integral part of their traditions, like I said, since time immemorial. After surviving attempted state-sponsored genocide, cultural genocide, colonialism, California's tribes deserve to have their cultures protected and tribal beneficial uses recognized. Tribal beneficial uses are incredibly important to these tribes, as you have heard, and they are essential and necessary for complete protection of cultural resources throughout the Delta watershed. The board should assert its authority and take action to protect TBUs within the Bay Delta Plan per their authority to designate beneficial uses. As was mentioned, the regional water boards are slowly adding TBUs into their basin plans, but those are separate from the Bay Delta Plan. And originally, the TBUs were not considered for the Bay Delta Plan. But failure to implement TBU protections in the Bay Delta Plan, Bay Delta puts TBUs and the entire watershed at risk because it is at the heart of the vast watershed. Further, designation of TBUs is urgent. Currently, there's no set time limit for which TBUs must be implemented by the regional boards. But if the State Water Board were to adopt TBUs, and it would be major progress in implementation of TBUs throughout the state. Expansion of beneficial use protections is necessary for improving water quality as well. More beneficial use protection means more protection for water, for flows, and the surrounding ecosystem. When there's poor water quality, tribes risk the loss of resources they have used since time immemorial, including salmon, tule, shells, the water itself, the materials used to make my necklace and my earrings. But there are some proposals that pose a threat to TBUs in the Bay Delta. One of those was mentioned earlier, voluntary agreements that are being considered. Using these privately created VAs instead of the established administrative process would be exclusionary and unfair to tribal communities that are negatively impacted by poor flow allocations, leading to poor water quality, dwindling fisheries upon which these communities have depended. The VAs would only benefit older water rights holders and not tribes, or the environment, or downstream water users. The second and third threats are the Delta Conveyance Project and Sites Reservoir. Both of these projects propose to divert water from the Bay Delta watershed. Various tribes have spoken out against both of these projects because of the impact they would have on cultural resources and TBUs. But before either of these projects moves forward, the Bay Delta Plan must be updated, which should include the protection of TBUs in the Bay Delta Plan. One last point I'd like to make is to encourage the board to follow the Racial Equity Action Plan guidelines. Full support of tribal communities should be the priority in developing the Bay Delta Plan, and that includes adding TBUs to the Bay Delta Plan. Inclusion of VAs in this process, for example, is counter to the goals of the Racial Equity Action Plan. Plus, failure to provide timely updates to the Bay Delta Plan has continued to harm vulnerable tribal communities, and they have suffered. Including TBUs would improve tribal engagement. The board has been making improvements regarding tribal engagements, but there's still much work that needs to be done. It may be difficult for tribes to engage and remain in the TBU process with the regional boards because there is a lack of resources, as was mentioned, and the long timelines. Right now, the board has the perfect opportunity to engage and collaborate with tribes on this and to learn from them on how to best protect tribal cultural resources in and around the Bay Delta. Doing this will ensure proper tribal consultations, incorporation of traditional tribal knowledge, and effective protection of tribal beneficial uses and cultural resources for tribes. Again, I just want to thank you for your consideration of TBUs. It's really important. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak on this panel. California tribes have already suffered so much and lost so many cultural resources. And I encourage you to include tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan to help preserve tribal culture and traditions for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been one of the most impactful and meaningful panels that I think I've really had the honor here of being part of here at the board. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And here I know a history that isn't easy to just repeat and have to relive in its repeating. What, for me, the word that always kind of continues to come up is reconciliation. We're reconciling what is a history, certainly, that we're not proud of here in the state. The governor made a point to apologize for the first time as governor here in the state as he came into office. And we have these watersheds that have been altered. We've changed in ways that have contributed to what we now have as nearly 40 million Californians in the state, but it has come at great cost. And I think here, what we all are forced to do is just kind of accept what is a real regrettable history and figure out how we're going to continue to contribute to a trajectory that's not the same. And whether that's the way we connect with and acknowledge our tribal communities, and importantly, what that means about the way we view our management of water here at the same time, is not lost on me, and I just want to acknowledge, because I know it's long overdue that tribal beneficial uses are acknowledged and incorporated into a lot of our work, because they are the longest standing amongst us people here. And so, and want to thank the good work that's gone on to here have us at this moment where we're able to consider their incorporation and know that we have a ton of work to do over the next year if we're going to meet the timelines that we continue to articulate here. So I really appreciate this panel, this engagement. I'll want other board members to ask questions and engage here. We'll take a break, and we have additional commenters, public commenters, but I just wanted to take a moment here and just acknowledge and thank and voice my strong support for the inclusion of TBUs in this project. And we'll continue to have discussion around what that means. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that and hear that we can incorporate TBUs into the project, but there's still water quality tribal beneficial uses that are explicit at the regional board levels to different water bodies and different protections. And there's a continuum of work here. So I'm supportive of us doing our part as we can to incorporate them. But know that there's still a lot of work, as was acknowledged, around the specificity of really complete embracing and moving the work forward around tribal beneficial uses, their enumeration and protection within water quality plans across the state. Of course, please, Ms. Moreno.
So I just wanted to thank you. I like the fact that you brought up reconciliation. We do need that. We don't need to relive past mistakes. And so the point I want to make here is we, speaking for Shingle Springs, are in opposition to the voluntary agreements, to that entire process. It was an exclusionary process Tribes were not consulted. To date, I don't believe there's been a discussion outside of the Water Board with Water Board staff on that process. That was extremely disappointing. So as we're talking about not repeating mistakes, we already went through, almost near erasure. We've gone through, being invisible, and we should not be supporting any process or projects or policies that perpetuates that.
Thank you, Ms. Moreno. Other board colleagues, any questions or comments for the panel? Board Member Morgan.
I just wanted to echo the chair's comments and, just thank each of you for being here. It was a very impactful panel, and appreciate all of your comments and, the presentations. I know that it is at many times not easy to come and to express a lot of just everything. I am just very grateful for you being here today, and also want to express my strong support for including tribal beneficial uses in the plan. Thank you.
Vice Chair. Oh, apologies, Vice Chair, you're on mute.
There we go. Well, thank you. For me, this has been very educational, and I especially appreciated the slides going through the ceremonies. I learned a lot. And so I think that it was helpful to have this panel where we could get additional information. So for me, I think, not expecting an answer for this right at this moment, but just wanted to flag that I'm looking forward to the process going forward to better understand tribal beneficial uses and what would be required and how things would be different in any way. As I indicated, for me, this has been an education. And so I don't want to presume that I know or understand what would be necessary, preferred, or required for any of these uses. And so I'm looking forward as we go through the public comment period to better understand what the different uses would require. And then also, I know staff mentioned that the Bay Delta Plan update would include flows to meet these uses. And so I'm really looking forward to receiving comment from all stakeholders on their perspectives as to whether or not you view that to be accurate. One thing that's really important, I think, for all of us is to, make sure that we're clear about what this means, what it doesn't mean. And again, I think that we can sort through a lot of that discussion as we go through the staff report and then also the public comment opportunities going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and agree with you that it's going to be about the how and hear the specifics of the incorporation of TBUs into it. So I look forward to having things that we can consider in language, but here appreciate it's going to be important to be clear as well. What differences does it make within the work as well, and be clear about what we're trying to accomplish within the incorporation of them here in the update of the Bay Delta Plan, and what is still other work that regional boards here, the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board, would be doing. Gary, please.
I just have one question I'm going to make a statement. We're going to take a break, and then what's going to happen?
We'll take a break, and then we still have additional commenters. So I'll go through the public commenters that we still have listed here that weren't part of the panel.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering what that was. What you mentioned reconciliation, which is a nice word. There are 3 bills that are coming through the legislature now, which are a direct result of action that people on this committee or this coalition has done in an amicus brief to support you guys for curtailment purposes, which, the court didn't see it our way. But now the legislature has decided that you guys need that authority, and we agree. There's also the bill coming through, which is directly of our petition and our civil rights complaint, and the amicus brief dealing with senior water rights, and statements that we've done about where did they get their water rights from. They acquired their water rights, senior pre-1914 water rights, from murder, mayhem, and massacre. They went and cleared Indian villages out and claimed the land and claimed the water. So there's a bill saying, okay, now let's see where you got your water right, explain how you got it and that. If those things go through and they become signed into law, and we're talking about reconciliation, then we need to talk about tribal water rights. Because that's the only way you're going to reconcile with the tribes fully. And that will take care of your tribal beneficial uses if the tribes finally get some mention or designation of tribal water rights, which were our rights in the first place. So I just thought I would put that one out there, and I appreciate it, and thank you again for letting us speak.
Thank you for the comment, Gary. Appreciate that. Thank you. Other board members?
Yeah,
Board
thank
Member
you.
McGuire.
Yes, thank you. I just want to offer my appreciation as well for the entire panel today and sharing your comments. I wholeheartedly concur with the other board members that this is a very impactful and meaningful step that the board indeed needs to take here to add tribal cultural beneficial uses to the Bay Delta Plan. It's long overdue. So I'm glad we're here at this moment and completely acknowledge that this is the beginning of a process that is going to take some time. And adding tribal beneficial uses to the Bay Delta Plan does not protect wholly those beneficial uses in and of itself. And so I'm here today as one board member who is here to learn as well. And so this has been very, very helpful for me to learn about the historical practices, the uses of water, the significance to the various tribes in the Bay Delta area. So thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing some of your perspectives. And Ms. Maloney, I also want to thank you for your very helpful presentation and just coming out and providing specific recommendations for how the board can better work with tribes through the consultation process, and some very practical, I think, recommendations for things and steps that we can take meaningfully to protect tribal beneficial uses. It's really helpful, and I look forward to working with you and everyone on the panel as we go forward to really better understand how we can best support you and make the Bay Delta Plan meaningful going forward. So thank you again.
Thank you, Board Member. Board Member Firestone, I apologize. I'm getting a note that we do have actually one more panelist that was joining us virtually that is on the Zoom platform. Do you want to provide comment now, or should we go ahead and have the Zoom panelist? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Board Member. Apologize, and apologize to person that it's on. I apologize. I'm not on the platform, so you have to. Okay, Laverne Bill. Apologize, Mr. Bill.
Yeah, Hekomi Boisai, Leokas Sudamatuka, Leokas Pasani Checketwin, Nanyu Yet Laverne Bill. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laverne Bill. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Nomalaki Band of, our Paskena Band of Nomalaki Indians. So I'd like to thank this committee for allowing us to provide feedback on this particular project and really provide, in our perspective, some valuable information as far as the effects that it's going to have on the tribes that are up and down California. And I do apologize for jumping on a little late, but I know that my fellow tribes down below near the Bay Delta have really provided a lot of valuable information. We're up a little bit further, but this particular undertaking is going to affect us as far as the water and the beneficial uses that we've been able to try to take advantage of. A lot of the projects that we are working on within our Aboriginal territory are to, bring back the salmon. And, with this particular project and the water that it's going to take, it's really going to have some extreme effects on the salmon and what we do. And we feel that all the work that we're doing, and even the gentleman further up north within the Winneman area, we're doing all this great work to help revive the species, to bring back a lot of the old ways, and even the foods that we've been able to slowly utilize. It's been taken away from us from a long time. As we look at these tribal cultural resources and the effects that it's going to have on us are extremely detrimental. When we go to these areas to gather, when we go to these areas for ceremonial purposes, and then to be informed that, the loss of water is going to happen, is of huge concern to us. I think as we start discussing partnerships, this is one project that we feel that the partnership isn't there. I've been on calls with the team for the past, I believe, 5, maybe even almost 6 years, trying to educate the team on, what are cultural resources? How do they affect the tribes? But really, what are tribal cultural resources, and what effects can they have on tribes? If they're plants, if they're animals, the various species that are going to be taken away or affected, and the genocide that comes along with that. I feel like we can't provide enough information to educate everybody. And I don't know if competency is the appropriate word, because how can you truly understand each other's culture? But I think if you can sit down and discuss, what those issues are and the effects that it can have on the people, so you got to, really have those difficult discussions, and then try to understand, what is solutions, what solutions can each of us provide. A lot of these engineers that are coming up with these great projects, aren't really stepping foot outside of these 4 walls and talking to the people. I don't think moving the water down there is necessarily a bad idea, but I think when you're bringing big, pipes and running them under the ground and diverting the water, I think those are the effects that can be detrimental for not only the tribes, but the farmers, the local communities, all up and down the areas. And I don't think that, people really understand the ramifications of the effects that it's going to have. We've slowly diverted the water over the years, and it's beginning to affect each of us in different ways. So I think what I would like to really, hit home is, I think there needs to be more one-on-one conversations between the committees, the individuals that are dealing with this, and helping them understand how we can partner on this, and understand if there's other ways to utilize the water and divert that water. What does that look like? I don't know how many more times I can emphasize on these meetings the importance of collaboration and even partnerships, but I think it's something that I continue to talk about. Some of the other tribes are really trying to provide that same discussions with this group. How can we partner together? How can we better understand what this looks like? So with that, I'd like to be more involved in these particular discussions. I would like, from our perspective within our Aboriginal territory, help you understand that these waterways will affect our particular territory. how the work that we're doing up there to revive or grow some of these species, how what you're doing down here affects the work that we're doing up there. I think it's a trickle effect. We're not complementing one another. We're actually hurting each other. So, if we could sit down and similar to when we do highways, when we expand highways, we look at all the projects within these models and, really try to understand the effects that it has. This is very similar. If we could take a look at some of the projects that these local counties are doing, these local communities, and then start understanding, does this project make sense? I think this project was originally created probably before my time. And here we are in June 7th, 2023, still trying to strategize on a project to take the water down south. There's a lot of detention ponds that are being built all over the place. There's actually one within our territory, and again, and I'm not an engineer, but I know that, taking this water and trying to assist other communities in areas that are sensitive to the tribes or sensitive to, the local communities, isn't necessarily a good thing. So if we could, strategize with more options, I think that's what we're asking is provide more options, provide more solutions. Over the past 6 years, as I was explaining, there really hasn't been an option. This is the way it's going to be. The options is where the intakes are, not on ways to, divert the water or bring the water, or, how we can provide solutions to some of the people who are going to be affected by these deep reservoir or deep pipes that are going in the ground. So I want to conclude with that. I'd like to stay engaged in this particular committee, stay engaged in these meetings. I'd like to be a part of a solution and not a problem. I would like to make sure that we're heard from our Aboriginal territory, along with some of the other tribes. So, with that, I'd like to thank this committee for allowing Pasquena to provide feedback. And with that, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. I appreciate your contributions, and sorry if we skipped over you a bit there. And I think we do have one additional panelist as well, Sarah Ryan.
Good morning, Sarah Ryan with the Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians Environmental Director. I don't consider myself a panelist on here, just a commenter. So if that is still okay for me to speak now, I just have a couple of items. But the panel was fantastic. So as I mentioned, I'm with the Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians, and we are our homelands are in the Clear Lake region. However, our members do go to the ocean as well. And we rely on the water boards to manage the water rights and the water quality in the Delta and in other parts of the state. We do believe that tribal beneficial usage should become part of the Bay Delta Plan, both for subsistence consumption and cultural uses, because both subsistence and cultural uses are occurring in the Bay Delta area with a variety of tribes in a variety of ways. And it is a long process, so it should begin right away. What's happening in Region 5, where Big Valley is located, it's been a multi-year process, and there's many more years to go before we believe that we'll be able to get water quality objectives connected to tribal cultural uses, and therefore begin protecting them through amending permits and cleanup plans and things like that. So in order to protect tribal health, we believe that tribal beneficial uses should be adopted in all locations right away. One thing that we're concerned about is that the contaminated waters of the Cache Creek, certainly we can point out the cyanotoxin issues of Clear Lake with toxin levels, microcystin levels being over 200,000 times higher than the suggested action level for recreation that was originally set by OEHA or recommended by OEHA back in, I believe, 2014. So if we're sending waters like that, through Clear Lake down in Cache Creek and, ultimately into the Sacramento River and adding to the contamination from multiple locations, the discharges that are permitted, the Bay Delta is getting quite a bit of pollutant loading and impaired water quality. And so it's really important that that even if the way that the Bay Delta plan has been set up and how it's really more about flow, there are water quality impacts that potentially are, magnified because of the variety of pollutant loadings from multiple water bodies and watersheds going into the Bay Delta. And so the monitoring of water quality and biota is really important to ensure that there's no impairment for tribal beneficial uses, both consumption and cultural uses. And we think that monitoring should be really clear and clarified and transparent if it's happening with any state or regional entities. And if that monitoring is not occurring, then as has been stated earlier with the panel, building tribal capacity to do that monitoring and tribal organization capacity to do that monitoring in the Bay Delta to ensure that those water quality objectives are being met to protect tribal beneficial uses. We think that needs to occur right away because of the potential magnification of multiple contaminants coming down from all of the watersheds. So it would also be really helpful to understand that process very clearly, what tribes who use the Bay Delta should expect in terms of being able to get that information, how the regional board will work with the water boards in terms of any monitoring or assessing of the water quality impairments of the Bay Delta, and ultimately, just to set those targets and to work with tribes to set those targets that need to be reached in order to protect tribal beneficial uses. I believe that's all the comments I had. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ryan. Really appreciate your virtual participation, and it was good seeing you yesterday here as well. Now we'll go to Board Member Firestone, and we'll take a break and then receive the rest of our comments. Board Member, thank you for the patience.
No, thank you. Thank you to all the participants and the panelists. And I'm looking forward to all the folks that are taking the time to make public comments today as well. It's really, an honor, frankly, that you're spending your time participating in these processes. I think it goes to the faith that we are really doing everything we can to take seriously what we adopted in our racial equity resolution in terms of looking to advance reconciliation, to advance racial equity, including with Indigenous and tribal communities throughout our processes. I echo folks that, other board members' comments in terms of, very strong support for inclusion of tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan update. To me, it's extremely important that we're consistent throughout the state and throughout all of the basin plans. We already adopted a resolution saying that basin plan should incorporate tribal beneficial uses, and as we're updating the flows portion of the Bay Delta one, we should be doing that too. I share concerns across all tribal beneficial uses and all basin plans, including certainly this one, that incorporation of definitions is one step, but the real work and impact is when there's more specificity to incorporating exactly what that means and how that will be implemented. And that definitely is taking a long time throughout the state. There's some good reasons for that, and that we want to make sure those processes are really driven by tribes, and you know, doing an adequate job to do that more specific designation process. But I think within this plan, through the State Water Board, we need to be taking that urgency seriously, even as we're, you know, moving forward. I think this very big lift of updating, finally, the Bay Delta Plan update that has been in the works for many years, and we need to get done. I have a lot of notes just from this. I really look forward to follow up in terms of how we do this adequately, what this means, how this informs what we're considering in the Bay Delta Plan and implementation plan. And I think one of the pieces I'll just highlight of my many notes so far, and looking forward to, again, more public comment, is just, you know, in addition to the formality and incorporation and integration of tribal beneficial uses, we also need to be ensuring that tribes are part of the decision-making process in terms of management and implementation. And so I think as we look at the you know, implementation plan, consideration of any agreements, and adaptive management work, that we just take into account the need to incorporate and integrate and respect tribal traditional ecological knowledge and tribal beneficial use and standing as we look at what we adopt through our board process. And I think, again, the tribes that have participated and engaged with us, met directly government to government. I hope we can be doing more, and to everyone that participated on the panels today, and to folks that are participating in the public comment period. Thanks.
Thank you so much, board member. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a 10-minute break. We'll say 10 minutes and change, and come back at 11:50. And I'll just note we have about 10 commenters, actually about 8 or so thereafter. And so we'll make sure and get to those important comments, have additional discussion here, and just appreciate everyone's time this morning. And we'll come back here at 11:50. All right, everyone, it's 11:50. I appreciate great morning and discussion, and glad to continue it here. We have additional commenters, and I'd like to now get to then hear first Mary Kate Lowry. And after Mary Kate Lowry, it'll be Andrea Ventura, and then Regina Chicazola and Sherry Norris. And for folks who can see the scroll, we can help you prepare there as well.
I agree. Mary Kate Lowry, sharing the Center Walk, Great Lakes, Anishinaabe, SE, Wyandotte, Mate-Wimatosh. I'm here to support tribal beneficial uses, and it seems like everybody here understands the necessity for including that. I think that I just wanted to make the connection between the truth and healing reconciliation with the governor, genocide, and what was mentioned already here as continuing cultural genocide. Keeping it very simple, we've inherited a fatal infrastructure. This fatal infrastructure has resulted in the killing of rivers, which has resulted in salmon being on the brink of extinction, a cultural genocide. So I am encouraged by the comments. I'm encouraged by the open minds and the leaning of people towards movement in the direction of stewarding salmon, putting tribal people and tribal leadership and guidance first. TEK simply is the way I've been taught is their sustainability. The most sustainable natural resource management systems to date are tribal cultures, right? And that can't be said for, again, this fatal infrastructure we call, the United States government, the California government. We have to ask ourselves and leaders of this group that we have to change the paradigm about looking at water. Instead of diverting water for unsustainable big agriculture and putting that as a priority, putting profit as a priority. This is a very big deal. We are the Davids, and there's going to be a Goliath. This is not going to be easy, but we are here doing this together, turning away from wasteful water practices in our individual lives, but also as a state is essential for not killing the river, for not killing people's religions, not killing people's culture. And so thank you everybody for being here. I'm super hopeful, and I hope to convey the hope to the children and the youth that I work with that are looking at this process, and they're looking for leadership in the decisions of this board to provide hope. And thank you very much for giving me some time to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Lowry. I really appreciate your participation, your voice, and contribution to the discussion here. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Andrea Ventura, who will be followed by Regina Chicazola, who I don't believe is on the platform, so it will then be Sherry Norris.
Thank you very much, Chair SWRCB and members of the board. I am Andrea Ventura. I'm the Policy Director for Clean Water Action. I want to start out by saying that we stand with the tribal voices that you've heard today. They don't really need Clean Water Action to support them. They speak for themselves. We honor that, but we do want to express, as people of this state, our support. These beneficial uses should be automatic at this point. Implementation, it's going to take a long time. Implementation is going to require a lot of discussion and care with these tribal voices, but we should be designating our waterways absolutely to support their needs. These were our First Nations, and they deserve that based on their history and their environmental stewardship. As some of you know on this board, and I do not want to deflect from what we're talking about today, which is tribal uses and the Bay Delta Plan. But one of the things we have heard is this has been slow, that this is part of history. And we do want to express a little bit of frustration with the water boards in general. We fought with some tribal interests and other environmental justice advocates for over 10 years to get the state to even recognize both tribal cultural uses, tribal subsistence fishing, and subsistence fishing for other peoples of this state, which are largely, though not exclusively, people of color. It is unclear to me from the presentation given by staff today whether subsistence fishing beyond tribal subsistence fishing is included in the Bay Delta Plan, but we're wondering why it is taking since 2017 to get this done. We do work with multiple types of communities that also fish in these waters and may be fishing with different species and have different needs. I also want to just bring up that we are confused about how the Bay Delta Plan will affect the Bay itself. Region 2 has continually put in its triennial review its purpose to designate the Bay as supporting tribal cultural uses, tribal subsistence fishing, and general subsistence fishing, and yet they have done nothing. They've done it twice. It's like, if we put this in the triennial review, it'll look like we care, but then we don't have to really do anything about it. And we're getting really, really frustrated. We can walk and chew gum. We can protect all people. Again, please do not misunderstand me by trying to deflect to other populations what we need to do for our First Nations. They have the first call on the water rights in this state. And I'm proud that we are supporting some of the legislation that was mentioned today. But we're asking you as leaders, as the state water board, to be talking to your regions and say, you need to get moving. There are 3 beneficial uses here. We need to designate our waterways because we cannot be making decisions about their health and their future without including all people. We thank the tribes for their leadership on this. We are honored to be able to say that we support what they are calling for today. And we do so humbly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ventura. I appreciate your contributions as well, and long contributions and voice in all of this. To your question, the sub is included, so it is tribal subsistence fishing and general subsistence fishing as well. And when it comes to the work at the regional water quality control boards for the inclusion of the definitions and designation of water bodies and the real implementation work, I hear you. I know that we are all, as a board, continue to emphasize to the regions the importance of the work. I know when I talk to the chairs in our monthly chairs meeting, it has come up, but I think that what we need to make sure we start to do is articulate some timelines as best we can. So thank you. I appreciate the comments. I don't believe Regina Chicazola is on the platform. Oh, she is now. Apologies. Ms. Chicazola, you're on deck.
Hello. Thank you for letting me speak at this meeting. First of all, I wanted to say that I find this meeting really hopeful. This is one of the best panels I've seen in a long time. I feel like it's really important for the board to hear from the Delta and Upriver tribes, and you have, and the presentations were amazing. So thank you everyone who's there. Thank you board for having this discussion. It's critically important that these issues of tribal beneficial uses and the Bay Delta Plan happen on the state level, as it was pointed out, because the flow issues happen at the state level, as do these updates. And that said too, I look forward to seeing how you work with the regional boards to make sure that pollution issues that are not flow related are dealt with. I know that is a very hard needle to thread sometimes, but it is critically important that the regional boards can work with the state board for the authority to make sure that flows are able to happen when pollution is involved. And as we know, the Bay Delta, it really relies on clean water dilution in order to make sure that waters are usable and beneficial uses are protected. I did want to talk a little on timeline. Now that this is moving forward, I think this is great. I'm hoping that it can happen in a very timely way because, as you know, the Bay Delta Plan and voluntary agreements are moving forward. So if the tribal beneficial use process and how it's incorporated into the Bay Delta Plan happens slower than the rest of the process, then we're not going to be able to protect the tribal beneficial uses in the way that they need to be. Also, as you know, the site's reservoir water rights application is moving forward. And so that really highlights the need for the Bay Delta Plan updates to happen, especially with phase 2, as is the Delta Tunnel. Another thing that does not seem to take the time and get the consideration always needed is things such as temporary urgency change petitions. So anyway, I just wanted to say that how the tribal beneficial uses is implemented and the time that it takes is so interwoven with the voluntary agreements, temporary urgency change petitions, the voluntary agreements and things of that nature. And so hopefully this process can happen in a timely manner to make sure that it's being considered within all those. And I think that's why you're having this hearing today. So I just remember a comment earlier about how this was going to take a lot of time, and it's already taken so much time. So obviously meeting with tribes takes time, but hopefully this process can be taken seriously and happen very quickly. Also, I wanted to say that I feel like it's critically important that as you move forward with the board and you're considering tribal beneficial uses once they are set, that you really incorporate them into everything that you do and act to protect them in all these other processes that are before you. You know, as you know, when there are drought years, there's a lot of fighting related to water rights. It was brought up earlier that looking at tribal water rights in a very serious way needs to be part of this process, or at least a supplement to this process, especially as all these different water rights laws are being proposed. Again, tribal water rights and beneficial uses aren't always being considered and thought about. I haven't heard of tribes being involved, for instance, to these trailer budget hearings that are happening that are really going to impact them a lot. And obviously you're not the legislature, but your job is to protect beneficial uses. And so you are able to push back in different ways in order to protect tribal water rights and tribes in general through your decisions. So yeah, once the tribal beneficial uses go forward, again, thank you for moving now. I really hope that it's incorporated into all your decision making, into all of your permitting, and to your considerations of the Bay Delta Plan, Sites Reservoir, and Delta Tunnel water rights petitions and things of that nature. It is critically important to protect these beneficial uses in every way possible. So with that said, I just also want to thank you again. This is one of the best conversations I've seen in front of this board, and it shows that you are moving forward with the commitments that you have stated in the past. And so I look forward to working with you throughout this process.
Thank you, Ms. Chigazola. I really appreciate your comments and contributions and commitment to this work and project. Just to note, as I understand, we're comfortable in knowing that we can complete the TBU work and not impact our timeline when it comes to adoption of the Water Quality Control Plan update generally, and it be incorporated into that process. I want to maybe help clarify though, just so we are shaping expectations. As the process for the update of the Water Quality Control Plan update proceeds, is that where we will see, ultimately the text and work of the incorporation of the TBUs, and that's where people should be tracking along? Or, and maybe it's a little bit of both, will there be a sort of separate track as they're kind of further being teased out and then incorporated in, just trying to see what best we should expect for folks. Thank you, Ms. Riddle.
Yeah, great question. We are actually, the addition of tribal beneficial uses is being considered as part of the Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta Plan. So it's on the same timeline as those updates to the Bay Delta Plan and consideration of the voluntary agreements. That's all incorporated together and will be evaluated in the draft staff report that's planned for release this summer. We had originally thought the process might take longer, but we did some additional research and evaluation and determined that we could actually incorporate this into the existing Sacramento Delta update process. So that's what we're proposing to do, and as such, it should be considered on the same time frame as, which we're trying to expedite as quickly as possible. So sorry for the confusion on that. It was our own internal, we haven't actually added beneficial uses to the Bay Delta plan in the past. So this is a new endeavor for us. We're excited for the opportunity to consider the beneficial uses, and upon, thinking about it more and evaluating it more with our legal counsel, we determined this is something that we could actually pull into the Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta plan process. So hopefully that clarifies things a little more.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, Ms. Riddle. Really appreciate that. Next, I'd like to go to Sherry Norris, who will be followed by Ben Eichenberg.
And Ms. Norris, we see you're on the platform 2 different ways. We've given you the opportunity to unmute either on your computer or on your phone. And if you're choosing to use your phone, it is *6 to unmute.
Okay, and Ms. Norris, if you can hear us, please do just raise your hand on the platform and we can circle back to you. And I may hear at the end of calling additional folks, come back to you then. So thank you. Next, I'd like to then call up Ben Eichenberg, who will be followed by Keiko Mertz. Hello, I think you're our first in-person speaker, so, or at the podium, so you made it turn on the microphone. This is just a button at the top there. Great.
Sounds like it's on.
It should be, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Chair Exwell, board members Morgan and McGuire, and virtually Vice Chair D'Adamo and board member Firestone. My name is Ben Eichenberg. I'm here on behalf of San Francisco Baykeeper in support of the robust protections for tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta. First, I wanted to thank the board and staff for focusing on this important issue and for focusing on racial equity as well. As you know, California's water rights system is based on a racist history of discrimination, exclusion, and inequity, and no progress can be made toward equity if this history is not acknowledged. Tribes and communities of color have been kept out of California's water planning process. It's time to include them and to finally protect these interests that have been ignored and marginalized for so long. I want to note the cost to tribal representatives of sharing this information with the board and with the public. There are significant privacy concerns. I think we heard a little bit about that in some of those stories, but I just wanted to appreciate the sharing that happened and understand that I just want to say that how grateful I am to everyone who is willing to share their cultural and history with us. It's a sign of how important this work is, I believe, and we should never take tribal participation and all the benefits we get from it for granted. So thank you to everybody who shared their stories and helped us understand some of our own water uses and needs. I want to caution the board against treating these beneficial uses as redundant or as otherwise already covered by the analysis of other beneficial uses that have already been considered. These tribal beneficial uses must be evaluated on their own merits without presupposing that they are largely consistent with other beneficial uses. To simply fold TBUs into already completed analysis risks perpetrating the same inequities that this process was supposed to address and that the board's racial equity resolution calls out. Current standards in the Bay Delta Plan are not protective of TBUs. For example, tribal subsistence fishing represents harvest that is in addition to natural mortality and harvest protected by the commercial and sport fishing beneficial use. In order to maintain a viable population, a harvested fish population must exhibit greater productivity levels, viability plus harvest, in other words. And as the board staff has recognized, whether people are fishing for cultural reasons or due to economic need, the fishing rate is not optional or elective, as the recreational term connotes, and the number of fish consumed can be greater than that consumed by recreational fishers. TBUs extend beyond subsistence fishing needs and include ritual ceremonial uses of certain locations, as we've heard. And the vivid descriptions we heard today about sites on the McCloud River were really impactful for me, and I think for you as well. And I appreciate that that you expressed that earlier. With that in mind, the board must not only look at protecting sort of the shattered remnants left from our shared racist history, but also at reasonable protections for areas that can no longer be used but may be able to be restored to historic tribal beneficial uses. There's no reason to believe that protection of other fish and wildlife beneficial uses represents adequate protection of TBUs, and such an assumption is dismissive and insensitive to actual tribal uses of fresh water. It would be improper to marginalize TBUs by restricting consideration of flows. And such marginalization would, in turn, perpetuate the barriers to defining, quantifying, accessing, protecting, and controlling California Native American tribes' ancestral lands, water rights, in-stream flows, cultural resources, and beneficial uses, in contravention of the board's equity resolution. I would also like to urge the board to work expeditiously with the tribes to define in specific and measurable terms what outcomes reflect full and reasonable protection of beneficial uses. How much water, in other words, how much water is needed to protect the tule, to protect the willow, to give access to significant sites, to fulfill the spiritual and subsistence needs of the tribes. This determination must not come from a black box. Tribes have to be consulted and understand.
I'll get that out of there in a second. I'm next.
Sorry, Ms. Norris, we will come to you in a moment. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Tribes should be consulted, not only consulted, but also understand and agree with the protections determined by the board. Specific and measurable outcomes representing full and reasonable protection of tribal beneficial uses will allow the board to determine whether proposed standards and plan implementation are likely to adequately protect those uses, and following implementation, whether those uses are in fact being protected. This could be an impactful and meaningful step for the board to take. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. So thank you for your consideration of these comments.
Thank you for the comments and participation, Mr. Eichenberg. Appreciate the good thoughts. Next, we can go back to Sherry Norris.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So sorry, my phone didn't work through the process, but I'm here. My name is Sherry. I'm with the California Indian Environmental Alliance, and I'm very happy that this is before the state board today. I'm really thankful that it looks like there's a commitment to make sure that tribal beneficial uses are part of the Bay Delta plan. I would recommend, I'm going to provide two process recommendations. The first is that there be a tribal advisory committee that is developed for this process. In particular, we recognize and are in support of tribal consultation. But by having tribes have the ability to have conversations and build consensus in the process, what we have found in the SWRCB in creating TMDL process and the definitions themselves is that the back and forth between tribes in the regions, it was extremely important. And so that was my first recommendation. And second is that you do include tribal organizations. We supported that first process in the development of that language for 4 years. And there's several tribes, some of which have spoken today, that were part of those processes. So those of us that were there when the definitions were being created, remember we had really good conversations about how these definitions would be used, about the differentiation between the three definitions. And as you can already see, there's a little confusion when sub is put under tribal beneficial uses for the non-tribal communities and for those of us that are tribal and out of state. Does that apply to us? Does that not apply to us? It's really confusing. We never intended to put them underneath that heading. The idea was that for California tribal members and for California tribes, that the COL and T-sub would be for that use in particular. Because for the sub use, for example, I'm an out-of-state tribal person. And I can go to another water body in California and fish. But for California tribes, we have in all of our tribes are location-based cultures. We practice our cultures in connectivity to our traditional territories and waters. But for the sub, we can move to other places. It is an EJ issue in that it's hard for some communities, especially low-income communities, to travel in order to eat fish for subsistence purposes. And those are often the communities that are supplementing their diet with fish, for example. So I just wanted to bring those two things forward, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation hopefully in some sort of a tribal advisory committee. And I'm thanking you all so much. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you as well. I really appreciate the two good recommendations and points, and I'll be looking to follow up with folks around the ability to do that to keep the pace of engagement going. So I appreciate that, Ms. Norris. Next, I'd like to call up Keiko Mertz, who will be followed by Ada Stevenson, and then I believe our last commenter is Sydney Spiesman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Keiko Mertz, Policy Director of Friends of the River. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of Friends of the River, our thousands of statewide supporters, and myself as an individual. First, I would like to thank all of the tribal members and representatives for sharing their perspective and knowledge with us all today. I want to acknowledge that capacity and bureaucracy can be a major obstacle to tribal participation, and I truly appreciate their time here today. Thank you to Gary, Emily, Crystal, Casil, Laverne, and Sarah. Thank you also to the board for creating this space for tribes and considering TBUs in the Bay Delta Plan. We hope the board continues to build relationships with tribes, amplifies tribal voices, and protects tribal interests with the full extent of its authority. To that end, I encourage the board to continue to climb the ladder of citizen participation with the tribes, ultimately building partnerships, then delegating power and control. For more on the ladder, I encourage you to read Sherry Arnstein's 1969 paper titled The Ladder of Citizen Participation. To conclude, Friends of the River supports the inclusion of tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for yours as well, Ms. Mertz. Thank you for your comments and participation. Next, I'd like to call up Ada Stevenson. Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ada Stevenson. I'm president of California Indian Water Commission, located out here in Sacramento. We have a couple of things. First of all, someone had mentioned previously about how the route that they took for outreach, which was by telephone and letters. We really have a large grievance with that. I think that outreach, our California Indian Water Commission, we believe that stories need to be told face to face. Go out in the field where the elders live or our young people and sit down and let them tell the story at their pace, whether it be an hour or 2-3 days, whatever it takes, and to document that because it's more than a story. They're telling you the uses, beneficial uses of their water of the past, their current, and their hopes for future use. To reincorporate some of their traditional fishing or their traditional gathering, the old people wanted to let the young people say, we're not historical, we're current, we're vital, and we're teaching you how to do the old way. So outreach is more than a letter, it's more than a telephone. Those are privileges that people here in the city take for granted. I'm from a very rural community, and my phone number is for like 7 or 8 different families. When the lights go out, I'm the person that delivers the messages. And for when we do outreach, everyone considers reading and writing, it's natural. It isn't. I know many, at least 2 or 3 generations that came out of public education, they cannot read or write. So written documents mean nothing to them. You need to sit down with these folks in person. So outreach is critical to be in the field rather than to sit in an office and just take data information. So I believe that outreach has failed throughout the years, not just this board, but every agency in California. And one of the reasons is because the creation of tribal liaison was supposed to be the bridge between agencies and tribal communities. Some of them are good. Some of those liaisons are to be applauded, but the majority of them are just taking up space because they need to be educated by tribal people how to communicate outside of a written word where we do not understand the connotations and definitions of words that are used by agencies. It's beyond the comprehension. So it takes someone else to meet these folks in person and break down that story, what those questions really mean. What is the sustenance of that question? Because we don't read correctly or at all, and in some instances. Take the word sustainability, and along with the people that I hang out with, sustainability is really a catch-all, a word that was created by the state. It doesn't meet the needs of us. Sustainability throughout the years, because of the water diversions or the water contaminations, the sustainability bar keeps lowering, and we accept it. When does sustainability stop? Where we start recognizing that that word, that connotation is outdated. It doesn't suit tribal communities. We talk about the use of water in the past tense. That's fine. We have to remember our past. But we're talking about today. Looking for 50 years down the road, will we have water? The California state is divided between north and south, agriculture and the beginning of water. Well, I understand that intimately. I'm a hunter, I fish traditionally, and I'm a traditional gatherer. And I'm an educator of preschool kids, I used to be. And nothing felt better than teaching those little preschoolers and first graders the responsibility of the land and the water and trees. That's where we have to start. When we talk about outreach, it's not just to people in the communities. Outreach has to start in our classrooms. Outreach has to start with field trips, with tribal people coming in and telling the story why water is sacred, not only to us as people, but in the circle of life, to trees, to the meadows, to all the things that we consider necessary for our life. Tribal people everywhere that I know of have an unwritten agreement with nature that we will take as best care of them as we can. Harvesting, it means traditional fire burns. It means educating people that are supportive of us. It's a host of things that's unwritten, but it's a rule that we stand by. And the only way we can do that is learn from our past, listen to our old people, and to revitalize what we can. We know that we can never go back to the old days, but we can prepare ourselves for the future, and we can make sure that tribal beneficial uses is included. So we really strongly recommend that the board take these things seriously. A lot of us grew up around the old ways, the traditional ways. One of the things that I am getting less impressed with as the state of California, as the state grows older, is the water conditions, the diversions of water, how we treat it. We seem to place great emphasis on recreation use rather than traditional use. And I know that recreation brings in money and that's the economic thing, but sometimes we overlook our own humanity. And when we do that, we fall short of taking care of water and trees and our families. As a fishing person, I've gone to see salmon being fresh caught and competing with farm fish. I think farm fish are nasty. They just are. They look different, they're grown different, and they taste different. You know, if you want mush, eat cornmeal. Why bother with fenced-in fish? They're not natural. And so I wanted to talk about that word sustainability and also the connotation that it may be with different communities. I wanted to talk a little bit about tribal rights. Do we not, as tribal people, have the right to have clean drinking water? Do we not have the right to have access to affordable, potable drinking water? I think that Water not only should be a human right, but especially for tribal people who have suffered decades, if not centuries, of environmental injustice for access to water and access to get into our state forests. Something as simple as that. I remember I was able to walk around in our reservation and watch the flying squirrels, and now they're almost gone. They're almost gone. Why? The chemical use of different agencies, Caltrans or logging or water diversions where the trees can't grow any longer. So the impact of water is so immediate and so far spread, we fail to see the importance of our environmental disasters that are occurring every day. We don't see it unless we see it in the news that, oh, it took 10 years for that stand of trees to die. Why? Because the water was diverted somewhere else, or the water was contaminated and killed that stand. We don't see it. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And sometimes we lost our mind because we're not doing the right thing. I want to talk that we support the Bay Delta plan only if it includes TBUs. It's so important. Every agency needs to include us, our voice, our story, our science involved in the planning in the beginning, not the end stage where it's just a polite thing to include public comment. We want to be in on the beginning when it pops in someone's mind. Let it be our mind. Let us go to an agency and say, we have an idea. Can you help us? Let's try to reverse that role sometimes. And I think that tribal liaisons need to be educated, as I said previously. And why? Is because sometimes when you get in a position, you take it for granted that someone's going to look at you as peer evaluation. I would like to see this board or every board look at their own tribal liaisons and evaluate them, see are they being assertive, are they really caring, are they doing their job as best they can. I just don't feel comfortable with that because I don't think that we need tribal liaisons speaking for us. We have voice, we have story, we have history, we have hopes for the future. So I want to encourage each and every one of the boards and the panels. I really appreciate their time. And thank you for listening today.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson. I really appreciate you sharing your voice and perspective here on this important project for the board, and look forward to the further work ahead in incorporating the TBUs. So thank you, Ms. Stevenson. Next, I'd like to call up Sydney Spiesman. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sydney Spiesman, and I'm a student attorney at the Stanford Environmental Law Clinic. I'm here on behalf of and in support of several of our clients who have long been advocating for tribal beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan, including Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, Winnemem-Wintu Tribe, and Save California Salmon, who you heard from this morning. We appreciate the support the board has expressed for TBUs today. As the panelists so powerfully illustrated, the need to designate and protect TBUs in the Bay Delta is not only mandated by the State Water Board's statutory duties and racial equity resolution commitments, but it is also urgently needed to ensure tribal cultural survival and begin repairing the state's role in dispossessing tribal water rights and implementing a colonial water management system that poses existential threats to tribal identity. I accordingly provide the following recommendations to guide the State Water Board's designation and protection of TBUs through the Bay Delta Plan. First, the State Water Board should adopt TBUs during the Phase 2 update on a whole watershed basis, instead of by specific water bodies or parts of water bodies. This approach is in accordance with how tribes live and experience the watershed as one interconnected system. And there's ample evidence in the record that tribes have exercised traditional, cultural, and subsistence uses throughout the entire Bay Delta watershed since time immemorial. As Ms. Maloney detailed, scientific understanding of the interconnectivity of waters also supports the need for a whole watershed approach to TBUs. To do otherwise would ignore traditional ecological knowledge, would fail to protect species, cultural resources, and access to sacred sites essential to TBUs, and would give TBUs less weight than all other beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan, which are designated for the entire watershed. Additionally, The board must recognize that tribal uses of Bay Delta waterways and cultural resources are distinct from existing beneficial uses in the Bay Delta Plan. TBUs will likely require heightened protections, including increased flows. We applaud board staff for recognizing the need for flow-based requirements in this morning's presentation. Once TBUs are designated, the board should develop a framework for centering tribes and traditional ecological knowledge in TBUs implementation and throughout Bay Delta management. Tribes must play a central role in determining what water quality objectives are needed for meaningful protection of TBUs and must be engaged in water quality monitoring, including by building tribal capacity to do so where required or where desired. In closing, the board must complete the Phase 2 Bay Delta Plan update with TBUs designated through it without further delay. Moreover, the board must ensure other elements of the plan and its implementation are protective of tribes, EJ communities, and ecosystems. The board must ensure that all elements of implementation are established through open, participatory processes and not through exclusionary voluntary agreement negotiations with water rights holders whose claims rest on unjust foundations. If tribal uses are meaningfully protected and the Bay Delta Plan update moves forward in an inclusive manner, the benefits of a healthier Bay Delta ecosystem will not only serve tribes, but will also extend to all Californians who rely on the water, species, and landscape supported by this unique ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Spiesman. Appreciate your contributions and participation today. I just want to thank again what's been an incredibly meaningful and here productive morning and discussion. We've heard a lot, and here, as we've outlined, there's a lot of work to do in the year ahead as we update the Water Quality Control Plan, do the Sacramento Delta component, and here, importantly, do justice to the incorporation of tribal beneficial uses. There's still a lot to further unpack, as the Vice Chair noted, and we've discussed. It's about the details on how we're going to incorporate those. So we look forward to what will be a lot more discussion and engagement around this issue. I just can't emphasize enough how important this project is and how critical this aspect of it, I feel, really is to ensuring that we are setting ourselves on the right course for the next decades. We are overdue on our work, and we're looking to complete this in what is still feeling like a tight timeline by next year. So I just appreciate everyone's work and contributions to continue to see a successful completion of that project, and know that, again, we still have a lot of detail to go forward into. This isn't a decision point, so I just want to thank again all the participation, and again the real effort it takes to share what, again, is a history that we're all here left to reconcile. So just thank you, and look to any board colleagues if there's anything further they'd like to ask, give comment to, or leave us with here. Board Member Firestone, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe flag for staff, and this was something coming out of, I know the Tribal Water Summit, and then certainly brought up today in the comments, is more generally on how we're supporting tribal beneficial use designations, not just here, but across the regions. There's within implementation, there's some differing approaches around allowing a whole watershed or all waters a designation approach. And I think it would be really helpful for us to support developing some guidance to support regional boards, so not to take their leadership away, but to be able to engage with tribes and look for some guidance that allows some more consistency and clarity. I personally think that it's really promising, and I appreciate the comments today about the potential to allow for that kind of whole water designation. Again, it's similar to other beneficial uses, but that's not the way that I think different regions are doing it. So I think as we are doing this process, we should look for opportunities either both as part of this and maybe in parallel with the water quality program to figure out how we can support clarifying and kind of streamlining, I guess, and looking for some consistency where appropriate, tribal beneficial use work across the state. The other area that was brought up today, and even more so in the tribal water summit, was around data confidentiality and sovereignty. And again, I think there's work that maybe we could do at the state level with the regions to support the kind of a statewide approach in how to do that with tribes. And then of course, looking at how we can support funding for tribes to help lead the process in this. So just those three areas of whole water designations, confidentiality, and sovereignty over data, as well as funding, I think are things that as we're supporting tribal beneficial use designation, both here and implementing across the regions, we should be looking at what we can do at the state level to clarify and support and ultimately provide that kind of urgency to get these in place. So with that, just echo your words, Chair Esquivel, and thanks to everybody.
Many thanks, board member. Appreciate the good contribution and comments here. Yeah, I think we're just feel very appreciative. Thank everyone for their time, and looking forward to what is, I know, a lot more work here still yet. So I think with that, we can conclude item number 7. And again, to thank everyone for their great participation in it. And with the conclusion of item 7 is actually the conclusion of our board meeting today as well. So I just want to thank again everyone for a productive 2 days. Our next board meeting is June 20th. And so until then, be safe, be well, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.